Serious, employers, what's the most insane complaint you've had about an employee that turned out to be completely true? So I worked retail, and we got this guy named something like Gus. My boss tells me, hey, this guy's got anxiety, go easy on him, okay? And so I was like, okay, that's cool, I get it, I can relate. I do everything I can to help him make sense of the infernal godforsaken hellscape that is retail. It starts off with little forgivable things, forgetting a task here, forgetting things there, accidentally giving the wrong info and things like that. You know, newbie retail stuff like that. He quickly devolved in popularity as his complacency grew over time and his helpful attitude shrank. My guy started faking around during his shift, getting caught on his phone while ignoring backup cashier calls and things like that. He would make stabbing motions behind the manager's back to other employees, tell off new employees, and play it all off like he was some innocent dope who didn't know any better. None of this got him fired. Day after day was a new complaint from an employee about responsibilities he shirked, or a customer about blatantly wrong info like, oh yeah, we have another location up on the hill and we didn't. No idea whose son he was, because that was apparently all kosher. What actually got him fired is the one day he brought a dog and a super expensive dog collar into work. He claimed he almost hit the dog on the way to work, and it was running around wild, etc. He tried to sell the dog collar to a customer, then tried to adopt out the dog to a coworker. This coworker was competent enough to take the dog to a vet, whereupon they found the microchip and contacted the actual owners. That's where the fun started. It came out that Gus never found the dog at all. He straight up kidnapped this dog from his neighbor and tried to pawn it off, knowing full well what he was doing. The guy lawyered up immediately, tried to sue Gus, and threatened to sue the store and the store manager if Gus wasn't fired. Suffice to say, Gus was gone the very same evening. Nothing else came of it, but we talked about him for years and years. Many years ago, the bookshop I worked at hired a new employee with terminal cancer. Very sad, since she was quite young. She wasn't around too much due to the chemotherapy, etc. But when she was in, she worked in the children's department. She was actually a pretty good children's bookseller and was a huge fan of a fairly major American children's author. She ran the UK branch of his fan club and knew him personally. He occasionally flew her out to the States for events. One day, she wasn't in, and all employees were called to a staff meeting. We were informed that she had passed away. There was a lot of sadness. Her close colleagues were devastated. Only a few days later, one of our staff happened to go into a branch of McDonald's in a nearby town. Guess who was working behind the counter? Go on. Guess. Turns out she was never ill. She had made the whole cancer thing up, as well as faking her own death, for reasons that we never really fully understood. The general consensus was that it started out as a way to connect with her author hero and kind of spiraled from there. In the end, she couldn't handle living the lie anymore, and so just up and had her mother tell people that she'd died, and then got a job in Maxi's a few miles down the road and was surprised when she got found out. That was a pretty what the fuck sort of experience for us all. TLDR, admin assistant committed fraud, resulting in her boss and eventually her being fired because her dog had a nervous condition. My boss lost an internal power struggle and was soon fired. The official reason given was he was submitting fraudulent expense reports. I'm not promoted, but given all of his responsibilities and I inherited his administrative assistant. Suddenly charges for car service, local hotels, and local liquor stores appear on my corporate credit card. I ask the admin about the charges, and she gives me an explanation that's plausible, but that I know isn't accurate. I called the credit card company and contest the charges until they provide more info. I also started doing some of my own research on the charges. Turns out the admin assistant was an alcoholic who lived with her dog in the local hotel I was getting charged for. She was having the car service pick up her booze at the local liquor store and deliver it to her at the hotel. Why? Her dog had a nervous condition, and he liked that hotel. He would get upset if she went out to the store after she got back from work, so she used the car service so she wouldn't leave and upset the dog. She charged the expenses to my boss and my corporate cards because we owed her for making her come to work and leave her dog alone. I got her fired and successfully fought the credit card charges. Even though I found the person actually committing the fraud, my boss was still considered "fired for cause" because he signed the expense reports with the fraudulent charges. I've got a lot of these. Customer complained employee was stealing. Didn't believe it. At first. The gayest man I've ever known was stealing Playboy magazines. No idea why. Got caught with them. Multiple copies of the same issue. Fired. One employee was spotted by a customer pleasuring himself on the roof before the store opened. Also used a magazine. Didn't believe it. Staked out the roof. Turned out to be true. Fired. One customer told me the bookkeeper is up to something because she didn't get a receipt for a space she rented. Didn't believe it. Turns out, this employee was pocketing a few hundred at a time when a vendor paid in cash. Was doing all kinds of embezzling that wasn't easy to catch. Fired. Jailed. One customer walked in on an employee who was masturbating. There was a lock on the door. Lock not used. Fired. Customer spotted receipt showed coupon when they paid cash. Coupon code should have been cleared out of the system years before. It was 100% off coupon. This employee made an extra $100 or so per shift. Fired. Jailed. Mystery as to how they found the coupon code. One customer found a camera in the women's restroom. I knew right away who it was. Staked out the camera feed until I saw him go in. Fired. Jail. One customer was hugged by an employee. No idea why. It was the employee's first day. Fired. One customer spotted a security guard selling meth to his friends. He had been selling meth and other drugs on his shift for over a year. Added bonus when we got rid of him. Thefts went way down. One customer complained an employee pointed and laughed when an old lady fell. Reviewed the tape. It was pretty pronounced. She had tripped on an end cap, fell, and wasn't able to get herself up. He was pointing and laughing for a while. When someone else helped her up, he was berated about doing nothing. Not fired, though. I only know of this because it involved myself. But I was fresh working for a security company, 4 months give or take, given a new assignment with a couple of other guys on rotation. Someone who had been there a week or so more than me gave me the obligatory tour of the site, pointed out some hot spots, pointed out some key equipment that needed an eye on etc. Less than a week of shifts go by where the same guy offers me a bump of cocaine. Decline. Just over a month later, had a perfectly fine shift, no issues. About an hour before my shift, boss calls me up pissed as hell at me. Obviously confused. I get to the place early. The place has been turned over. Equipment is gone. Fence is busted wide open. The works. One of the on-site trailers has been broken into where just over $1,000 was stolen from a safe I knew nothing about because it was always locked. I was pointed to as the culprit. It took less than 5 minutes of conversation with the boss to get it ironed out, as because not only had stuff gone from this place, but other stuff had gone missing from other sites the cocaine guy had been to before. Fast forward, and one of the things taken was towable and found in the guy's driveway. Might as well have dipped himself in red paint, let alone his hands. Needless to say, he didn't work for that company after that. Also had a depressed boss years later who tanked the entire company, hadn't come in to work for more than a day each week, basically left his wife to do most of the work. Then because of a workers insurance thing he was collecting cash from everyone. Exact same night he ended up upside down in a ditch. When police arrived he was discovered with 2 hookahs and a lot of cocaine and just over $1,000 in cash. He'd basically used the money he collected from me and the other personnel, to which was over $5,000, and barely had $1,000 left from it. He was arrested. The company went under. Took a while, but we got our money back. The FD was having an affair with his assistant, who was married to a different employee in the company. That's not all that insane, though. What's insane is how we found out. I was the HRD at the time, and a criminal investigation is still underway, so some details have been changed. Sia approached me about rumors of the FD's affair. In retrospect, maybe I should have dug into it, but things were busy enough, so I discouraged him from listening to scuttlebutt and said we should only worry if we thought there was an operational impact. Private lives are private, was, and is, my position. A few weeks later, our auditors got in touch to point out that a subcontractor had the same company name as a dormant business owned by the FD. A quick call to the FD followed, and he confirmed that it was a coincidence. That's funny, said the auditor, because it has the same tax number. Whoops. Things happened quickly after that, and the FD, who was on holiday, resigned before we could push him with extreme prejudice. But at the end of the investigation, it turned out that not only had the FD set up a pal to work as a subcontractor so he could cream the profits off work sent his way, but he'd also been making creative use of the company credit card and had authorized a company loan to himself. A check of company cell phone records showed that there had been communication between his ex-assistant and him since he jumped. So we recovered her phone, examined the SMS history, and found not only that she was telling him about the progress of our internal investigation, but also the full history of their affair, with explicit detail. Assistant's marriage imploded. She resigned. In the end, the whole affair swept up multiple employees who'd been involved in the fraud, gutted the finance team, and taught us all some valuable lessons. TLDR, rumors of an affair turned out to be only the tip of an iceberg of fraud, deception and theft. Fasten up, readers, because this is going to make you sick to your stomach, especially to the ladies. My first job was with a very small company which had about 19 employees in it. As you can imagine, people tend to get to know quite a bit about each other with such a few number of employees, typically because there's a daily interaction with many of them. I sat across from a very young and attractive girl I'll call Helen. She was one of the art designers for the company and had been there for about a year. About a month into my new job, and we've talked a bit, Helen started making comments about a specific employee, who I'll call Bob, because I hate this name. Helen said Bob makes her uncomfortable, but has never done anything she could report. Little things like the way he stared at her as he walked by, or made idle talk, starting off with how nice she dressed. Helen arrived at the office about an hour before most people, which puts her almost in an alone status with Bob daily. She asked if I could come in early and I said, sure. It didn't take long for me to notice her issues, and yes, this guy knew precisely how to stay under that line of a talk from our versus pleasant daily conversation. Dude, made my skin crawl too. That feeling you know something isn't right, but can't do shit about it. Screw this feeling. Apparently, my early arrival must have hit Bob pretty hard, as his awkward conversation starters began to diminish as we'd engage in conversation. Before he came through the hallway, pretty hard turned into a serious matter. A few weeks after I started coming in early, we both began to experience some weird things. Helen would come in and find her seat was damp, or the items on her desk were rearranged. I found my chair would be missing, broke, and my computer refusing to start because it was unplugged. Just little things, but not all at once, but definitely noticeable. It couldn't be the fault of the night cleaning crew. So Helen and I decided to report these issues to ours. We believed they talked to Bob because the issues started to diminish. Unfortunately, not completely. In addition, things just started getting worse in a different way. For example, Helen worked on a new design for a customer portfolio, but the next day, the work was gone. Completely removed, even from backup. Her chair would still be damp at times, but not as it used to be. On my end, some of my code began to generate errors after new updates, which didn't make any sense, since the processes that were breaking weren't touched by me. Upon review of my code, it looked as though someone intentionally altered the code, just enough I wouldn't notice. Since I use source control software, I could easily see when the program was altered and who altered it. I reported this to ours as well as Helen's continuing issues. The our person stated it wasn't enough we had Bob as the author of the changed programs, since it couldn't be verified he was the one actually logged in. My boss, however, was started to get upset as well. With the issues and delays, he took notice, so he requested a secret meeting with the executives to figure out what was going on. The decision was made to put cameras into the office. One weekend, a crew came out and installed tiny cameras into the vents and began recording. What they found was shocking. Bob had always been an early person, but it was more than just to greet Helen. He would rummage through people's desk and stare at photographs, particularly of those with young girls. He took one of the photos and went over to Helen's desk, then dropped his pants and began jerking off. Once he was done, he went back to clean up his mess, which explains why her chair was damp. Point at my desk, he'd pick up my picture of my family and start finger flicking the image, I'm guessing at me. This particular day, he decided to remove one of the capstans from my chair. Of course, of that day, we had no clue what was going on. Point from our perspective, what we saw was about 9 AM. Several police officers entered the office and took Bob out in handcuffs. Surprisingly, a couple of employees clapped as he was led out. I guess he did something to them. 2. It wasn't until the police left Helen and I were called in and was told what they found on the video. Helen immediately started to cry. I couldn't imagine what the hell she was feeling, but a violation so disgusting to cause such a breakdown. Of course, the owner and CEO were very concerned for the employees and offered counseling and any other services, including as much time off as a person needed to help recover from the heinous act. It took time, but eventually, things got back to normal, but it was an experience I will never forget. I've heard about employees jerking/peeing into coffee, harassment, and other issues, but having experienced firsthand what it was like to know of these things, but at the same time, make it difficult to report, is why I put stock in what people say as a truth, rather than attention-seeking karma whoring. It happens. What's worse is when it happens, and you can't really do anything about it. At least the company I worked set up cameras to resolve the situation. My condolences to all those out there whose company won't do a damn thing about it. Mall art store, with a satellite store for cheaper grab and go items in the same mall. This is over 2 decades ago. This store went through employees so quickly because it was boring. 8 hours of a shift and 2 to 3 hours of work. Inside joke was employee of the month has a totally different meaning there. Stoners usually worked out better than not. Their point anyway. Good customer son-in-law was between jobs and was looking for a short-time gig. Store owner hired him and was being trained by female manager. Down their second day she said, I think we have a problem with this guy. He is faking creepy and I think he is a rappy. He would always close talk from behind her while she was explaining things. So we were all hoping he was just super awkward and help figure out tactful ways to tell him to back off. Which we did. We also tipped off head of mall security he was acting odd. Then he had his first alone shift. Female manager called me down again morning after his shift. We have a big problem. At that store we encouraged employees to be creative, even to the point of matting/framing their own stuff. This guy had put a bunch of photos of his kids behind the register, which alone is weird and unacceptable. But then all were nudes. Many were suggestive. I called the owner, get here now. No time for talk, get here now. He shows up fast because we never called him for little sheet. He calls the customer's mother-in-law first to get her to see the pics. She is horrified. We get her in touch with a lawyer we know and she calls the cops. We comes in for his shift, is fired immediately. Security escorts him from the property, telling him not to set foot on the property again. While this was happening for us, lawyer had police search his house. Find lots of CP, both of others, and of 2 of his 3 kids. He walks into house like, hey guys, what's going on? Is arrested on the spot. I think he got 30 to 40 years. Coworker works some extra hours and didn't immediately get the money and was told it would be in his next paycheck. He decided to harass the supervisor about it daily. I'm sitting next to him and he's talking about calling corporate to ask where the money is, and I advise him that's a terrible idea. Then he says he's gonna call the corporate for the paystub app we used to view our paystubs and ask where his money is. I told him this was a stupid idea because they only give us paystub and at no point handle our money. He lost it. He misinterpreted and thought I called him stupid. He went on a rant saying he was gonna kill me, that if he sees me out of work he's gonna beat my ass, told me to clock out right now and walk into the parking lot with him so he can kill me. I'm sitting as calm as can be, and sitting behind him is his shift supervisor, also calm, rapidly texting on her phone looking at me. I leave and go work my shift, and 15 minutes later I get a call asking about the whole situation by a higher up supervisor. Turns out the supervisor was texting her boss what was happening in real time. I was asked to write a formal complaint because they've wanted to fire him for a while and this was the best reason, but they needed a paper trail. I was more than happy to do it. Dude was crying in the office minutes later saying I should be fired too for calling him stupid. 3 weeks later a coworker sends me a screenshot of a GoFundMe he opened up asking for 10k to buy hats because he was going bald. The nerve. It sounds weird, but had an employee that was completely by the book. They kept informing me about every change to their work status like built-in raises and such to the point where it felt hostile a bit. It's kind of like, hey, I've accrued 8 hours time off, so I'm going to take Friday . Or I've been here X amount of days, I expect my wage bump on the next check. These things are written in. Funny thing is, they were so by the book, and everything is pretty much automated. After review, we were spot on with our dates of time off, and at increased point every week. That employee had some issue. I didn't get my raise, my portal doesn't show the correct amount of vacation. Yada point. We spent so much time proving we were right every week. We fought for months before they left and reported us. Needless to say, we were in the right in the end. Zero discrepancies. Doesn't mean they didn't slam us on social media to anyone looking to work with us. Hasn't hurt too much, though. Funny thing is, we are so lenient, the vacation thing isn't ever an issue. We allow people to go negative on vacation. There is literally no oversight. I worked on a cruise ship. One of the women that worked in the spa was having sex with one of the guys who worked on the bridge, and she got pregnant. The company told her she'd have to go home and come back after she'd had the baby. She got mad about this and decided to steal a bunch of spa products and pack them in her luggage to sell. When she got home, she was having a hard time fitting it all in her luggage, so she took all the products out of their boxes to make it easier to pack them. She then put the empty boxes into a clear plastic garbage bag which she left out in the hallway. She shared with the other spa workers for the cleaners to take away. One of the spa workers saw the garbage bag full of empty product boxes and told the spa manager. They had to let the woman try to get off the ship with the stuff because legal reasons, so the security manager told US Customs to make sure and check her luggage when she got off in port to go home. Customs asked her to open the suitcase and said, "Whose stuff is this?" She said it was all hers, at which point the spa manager and security manager come out from behind the curtain and she was busted. Customs gave her a choice between being prosecuted for theft or accepting a 10-year ban from the US. She took the ban. Did factory management for several years, and one of the facilities in my region was getting super low production numbers, so I was sent in to investigate. When I get there, I'm approached by a floor worker who says he has some things to tell me. As it turns out, the female plant manager had been sleeping with employees on the clock in her office and was giving out raises to these guys who slept with her. I interview every worker and more than half of them show me evidence of this happening with her. Female manager is fired. All is good in the world. Nope. Dumbers. Female manager wanted to file a wrongful termination lawsuit, and her evidence she presented were recordings from her office of her sleeping with the workers, and she also had one video of her with the guy who had done my job previously. She tried to claim that she only did it because of fear for her job from her boss at the time. Our legal team hashed it out and told her that it was incredibly stupid and that, even though that old manager had abused his power, that wasn't an excuse for sleeping with 75 plus guys while at work. To further sweeten the pot, her video she took of this and stored on her unsecured personal computer contained classified documentation. My company I worked for was Begin Aerospace Manufacturing, and that specific facility was producing combat essential parts for USAF fighters. She had filmed this with an Ultra HD security camera that overlooked her computer, and in many of the videos you could see documentation and blueprints, all of which were protected by military security clearance. So that's the story of how she caught federal charges of negligence with classified material. Dude, I was waiting for this one. So there are these really bullshit, but fairly high paying, for some, jobs as fundraisers. They wear EMT uniforms and collect money for our emergency rescue centers because they are not funded by the state. So the job is to ring like 100 doorbells a day and pitch your talk to try and get people to sign a monthly subscription for their local EMTs for a minimum of €5. As you could imagine, this job is pretty hard because 95 out of 100 doors are opened by people that are pretty annoyed by your existence and are not really interested in giving out their IBANs to a random person in the door. On our team there was this fat guy that was a professional folklore singer normally and did this fundraiser thing as a side hustle. We had a really bad day in Stuttgart, Germany, wealthy but stingy AF, and our mood was pretty cynical by lunchtime. After lunch we went into the next street and there was this dude that opened the door that was just not having it and closed the door on us mid-sentence. It kinda felt like the drop that caused the flood for us because it was hot as fuck and people treated us like assholes the whole day. My colleague ringed the doorbell again, lifted his shirt up revealing he had drawn a smiley face on his massive hairy belly. He must have done it in preparation in the morning, legend, and started to sing our pitch script while squeezing his huge belly so that his belly button did the singing point. The dude complained to management, but they thought it was a prank call. They told us that in the evening and we played it off as if that would be absolutely crazy. Point, yeah, that was pretty funny. Told this story on a sub a couple years ago, but it's pretty wild. Point, not the employer for this story, but it's still pretty wild. Point, one evening I had a regular come into the gas station I worked at while I was in the back room cleaning out our boiled peanut pots. When I heard the door ringer I came to the front to man the register, and he was standing at the front door, stiff as a board and not moving. He sees me and looks relieved, gathered his usual items, then approached the register. He then tells me he's glad I was working that night because in my night off he came in and didn't see anyone in the store, gathered his items, and waited at the register. He waited a while before noticing the door to our back room was open and went to investigate to see if someone was in there and didn't hear the ringer. Apparently he caught my coworker mid self-pleasuring and immediately left the store. Point, I was mortified, and he was even more so. Point, apparently the coworker was talking with his then separated wife over text message and they were mending their relationship and decided to send him some nudes. Legit. This one made me laugh and I still think about this one every so often. Point, worked at Best Buy for a number of years. One guy, total arrogant asshole that would constantly hit on the female employees and say would be the best night of your life. Note this was regardless of age. He was in his mid-20s. Some of the girls he'd say this to were 17. He worked in computers. I worked in gaming, but I knew a few things about computers, so I'd hop over there and try my best when they needed help. Point, a woman comes up to me and points to the douchebag. You'd better get managers to start looking at that guy over there because he's a pompous asshole and I think he's stealing iPads. K. Whatever. Little outrageous, but I believe the pompous asshole bit. I talked to the lady a bit more and she was pissed because she'd been in for weeks trying to buy a new iPad, but we never had any, and she worked with him a few times. I knew that was bogus because just the other day I saw an entire cart full of iPads and this was well past the days of iOS device shortages. Went out back to look for her because I was certain we had some back there. Nothing. Not a single one. Fast forward a couple more weeks and the whole iPad thing was way out of my mind at that point. Hadn't thought about it once since that day. My manager, excellent guy, comes up to me and asks me, I'm not saying you did, don't worry, but if you were to take product out of the store, like steal it, how would you do it? Thought for a second about the systems we had in place and processes and potential weak spots. I'd probably put it in the garbage chute out back. We only run the compactor on Wednesdays and Saturdays after we close, so there's a set schedule of when that happens, and there's no inventory control system on the chute door, so no alarms go off if product is put through there, and all you have to do is swing by after close on any of the other nights and go through the compactor, which is always unlocked. That's when I thought to myself, maybe I shouldn't have said that, because maybe someone did steal something. Yes, someone did. Point, so they didn't know how someone was doing it, but it turns out my explanation was 100% accurate. They decided not to confront me about their suspicions immediately and instead set up a sting operation to catch me in the act. So they parked a car a ways away from the compactor and had someone watch it for a few hours at closing time, and also pointed a camera at the chute all day every day. They were so sure they'd catch me stealing. Turns out it wasn't me. It was the douchebag. He liberated a magnetic key for the spider wraps, the round inventory control things that have little cords that wrap around the product, and he'd sit there spider wrapping iPads pretending he was putting them out on the floor. He'd bring a whole cart full of them out to his department and find the island computers that no camera could reach and put them all in a big black trash bag and tie a double knot in the top. Then he'd bring it out to the garbage chute, throw it away, and swing by immediately after closing to collect his merch. Again, he wouldn't do it on Wednesday or Saturday. He stole hundreds of iPads and was selling them as new, unopened on eBay. Felony level theft. Not only was he fired, but before they brought him into the office to discuss their findings, they called the cops. He was fired and brought out of the office in handcuffs. Luckily for me, when they asked how he came up with the idea, he didn't try to say someone told him about it. He just said Best Buy is faking stupid and leaves. I got to personally sell an iPad to the lady who initially alerted us to the problem. She was incredibly grateful and so chill that I seriously wonder how much of an asshole he was that he triggered her to say what she said. I ended up working loss prevention for a few years after that. So I'm not an employer, I was actually an employee, but I have a funny story. I worked at a party city in high school, in a predominantly white and rich town, and almost all of my colleagues were white. My boss, who of course was white, drove a nicest car and always barked orders at us anyway. One day I hear over the walkie that I'm wanted in the back. I go into the back and my boss, the one with a little change, was sitting in there looking angry, but kind of like satisfied in a weird evil way. And then my manager, who was the only other non-white person, was standing there looking sad and disappointed. We were super tight. Boss asks me to sit down and says, "We know what you did." I say something snarky/silly like what? Organize the candy buckets 5000x. And laughed because I didn't know how serious it was, and he went, "No, there's hundreds missing from your till. Where is it?" At this point I remember turning white and stuttering, saying I have no idea how this happened, and explaining how neurotic I am about giving correct change. I used to check obsessively and count my drawer regularly. Well, it gets to the point where they're near firing me, and I ask them to check the cameras because I'm crying and have no idea how my till is short. Well, on camera, there's my boss taking a shit ton of money out of my drawer while I was stocking shelves. He swore he forgot, and it was just for a bank deposit, but he had it hidden in his jacket pocket when asked about it. He was never fired. I quit like a month later to go to college, and that's the story of how a history white boss tried to steal money and blame the tiny brown girl. Working at a fast food restaurant, one of the casual kids we had came in to buy lunch. Not unusual local staff discount, get to make outrageous requests and add-ons lol. So this was over a decade ago and in Australia, where if you used a credit card, you had to sign the receipt. Cashier checks that it matches the card. Hunky-dory. Usually. This time, the cashier comes out to see me and says, "Hey boss, Sarah Silikid just paid for a meal with a credit card in the name of Lachlan Lost Kid." I wasn't sure what to do, so I put it through, but there was no one else with her, and I don't know anyone with that name in her family. I get it. It's awkward to question your coworker and friend about fraud, and it was like a $6 meal. Cashier was young and trusting. I record the transaction details and speak to the store manager. Don't recall the exact specifics, but as it turns out, Lachlan Loskard had used and subsequently dropped his credit card in the restaurant, and we found via CCTV that, while doing a crappy job of cleaning the front, Sarah Silikid had pocketed it, didn't mention it to anyone, didn't attempt to find the owner or hand it in. She just came into her own workplace later and used a stolen card at least 3 times. Last time declined because by then Lachlan Lost Card realized someone else had it and presumably had the bank cancel it. No, she got fired. Not sure about any legal ramifications as Sarah Silikid was under 18. Store manager told me later that Lachlan Lost Card had even come back in the store the day before the card was used and asked Sarah Silikid if it had been handed in. Kinda sad that it was used for such cheap meals. Not sure what her home situation was like, but if she'd let us know she was struggling or something, we would have comped her a meal or given her an extra shift here and there, but she was pretty blasé about being caught, so I don't think it was that. Probably just because she could. When I was 18 to 19 I worked at a big box store, you know which one. Even if I don't say, the guy who trained me, and later became my manager, was a former military vet. I'll call in and had issues. He was prone to fits of rage over non-issues, like products being unscented on display shelves, storage boxes in the back room being half empty, and products missing he'd failed to order. He constantly trash talked all my coworkers behind their back, I'm sure including me, as well as his superiors. To hear and tell it, he was the only competent person in the entire store, and should be running it by himself. He would talk about how he was a pilot who flew helicopters, and didn't need us Orias to run a tight ship. Eventually, when he was stressed or angry enough, or if he'd just worked himself too much, he would snap, and punch himself in the face, while screaming through gritted teeth. It was a sight I got to behold more than once, and, as a sheltered 18-year-old working his first job, it freaked the piss out of me. When he wasn't having rage-induced tantrums in the back, he would talk about his guns. Sorry, I meant he would wax poetically about his guns to anyone who he could corner. To hear him talk, and had an armory in his attic, that Wayne LaPierre would think was a bit excessive. He would talk about nothing besides his gun, seemed either incapable or unwilling to discuss anything without even a tangential connection to firearms, ammunition or accessories for firearms. Now, this is in Texas, for context. Liking guns is fine. I don't own any guns, but have no problem with people who enjoy shooting for sport or fun. N was not one of those people. N was the kind of person who built his entire personality around guns and weapons, and how they made him better than everyone else. Instead of a company-issued box cutter, N carried a Bowie knife that I'm almost positive was illegal. He once stabbed in me the stomach with a crenellated flashlight, like this, to show off how it would hurt. No marks were left and management didn't take it seriously. Once he threw a 5.56 bullet at me while giving me instructions and told me these travel faster if you fuck up. Needless to say, working under him was goddamn nightmare. Anyway, he finally got fired after all this shit and countless complaints when he had one of his tantrums on the floor in front of customers where he screamed that he wanted to line up the entire department and shoot us all execution style. I guess plausible deniability couldn't save him from a store full of paying witnesses. Go figure. He was fired within the hour and I came back from my day off to a much more fun place to work as a postscript. About a month before I quit the store, we had a new worker join the team who had actually been stationed at the same base as N a little after he's discharged. As we regaled him with stories of the nightmare we survived under N, he laughed and said, "Was his name N30th? It was. That guy didn't know shit about flying helicopters. He took one up in the air once, crashed it, and spent the rest of his tour flying a desk fin." I had two guys 2 years apart have similar milk-instigated diarrhea problems that were too stupid to believe. New hires often took a bit to get up to speed as it's a physically grueling job, so when the first new kid was barely getting any grass cut his first day or two, it didn't immediately trigger any alarms until one of the crew told me that he'd been looking for him for an hour when he'd found his mower unattended in a yard. They complained that the new kid must be hiding in the bathroom for half the morning. I started watching him closer the next day and realized that his breakfast consisted of a liter of chocolate milk and a chocolate chip chocolate muffin. Sure enough, an hour into a hot sweaty day of pushing a lawnmower, off he went to the porta potty to have a 2-hour break. When I confronted him about it, his exact words were, "Oh, I know it's not good for me, but it feels so good in my tum-tums." The second guy was one of those people who told a lot of stories, so you never really knew what was true, even his age, but I'd guess he was actually in his early 40s. He showed up every day in mechanics overalls with nothing for lunch but a 4-liter jug of milk and an apple. We were not allowed to ask residents for anything. We often did stratas like townhouses, so if we needed to pee, there was a clubhouse key, or you found a bush. But for some reason, after a month on the job, and knowing this full well, overalls apparently goes banging on a resident's door and gives them a sob story asking if he can use their washroom. Of course, the sweet older lady who lived there couldn't say no to anybody, so even though she was apprehensive, she let him in. Turns out the guy had cheated himself. From what I heard third hand, it seems like he'd stripped down attempted to wash his man panties in her sink, used up all the TP he could find, and wadded all the nasty remains up in her garbage can, then went rummaging through her cabinets to find anything that could mask the smell on him, and in the bathroom basically he came out smelling like sheet and shea butter. Her bathroom was completely violated. And he was immediately fired. I worked as a subprime debt collector for a bank. We all worked at a call center and we worked in teams. The team I was on was consistently either first or second place for most money collected monthly for a year. We received large bonuses equivalent to anywhere between 2 weeks to a month's salary, and were given at least one catered meal for being the top earning team of the month. All of a sudden another team blows us and our main competition out of the water. Then it happens again next month. Then a third month. At this point there's roughly 60 people that are pissed and wondering how they are losing so badly. We ask management if we can do side by sides to hear what they're doing so drastically different than what we are doing. This would allow us to listen to both sides of the conversation to pick up new skills. Management obliged us and a few of us did the eavesdropping. We learned nothing new. In fact they stunk out loud when we were listening and underperformed compared to how we were doing that same day. At this point we complained that something had to be happening to get their numbers so much higher than ours. About a week goes past, then that whole team disappears from the floor into a meeting room during prime time hours, where no meetings are allowed. Then multiple security guards come in and post up outside the meeting room door. Once the door opens the whole team and their manager are escorted off the premises by security. They were all fired on the spot. What they were doing was keeping paper records of customers who would pay off their credit card accounts in full when they were called. They were telling these customers that they would be their personal banker from now on and would call monthly to do the payoff over the phone so they wouldn't forget and get a late fee. They also were giving these customers a $15 credit for paying their balance off with them over the phone. The team's manager was the one who came up with the idea and the whole team went along with it. It took us all complaining for the site director to go behind the scenes and put the manpower into listening to every call of a few employees on that team, then all of that team's employees' calls, then finally going through their locked file cabinets when they weren't at work to find the evidence of their crimes. I worked at a movie theater and we had a new employee. We will call her Sarah. TBH, right off the bat she had an attitude with almost everyone, but if anyone got upset she would try to be sweet and flirtatious to them to get them off her back. One day the movie theater gets crazy busy, probably the busiest I ever saw it. At the beginning of the rush she comes up to me because I was the trainer and she tells me she just got a call. Her father had a heart attack and is in the hospital and the doctors say it doesn't look good and he might not make it. We immediately tell her, with management permission, to go be with her dad. So we get rocked. We were already busy, and with a person out we were screwed. I got cursed out twice that day for not getting people's popcorn as fast as they want. Anyways, a couple hours later it dies down, and we finally catch our breath, when suddenly Sarah walks in with her boyfriend and tries to use her employee discount for free tickets. We got one free movie a day. We call down the manager and ask Sarah how her dad is. You could tell she forgot that she had lied to get out of work. She panics and starts mumbling some excuse about how her dad told her to go on a date to calm her down or something stupid, then tries to double down and starts flirting with the men working in front of her boyfriend. To say the least, it was very embarrassing for her and she was fired before she sat down for her last movie. I used to work as an addiction counselor for an agency that was contracted with local school districts. One of my colleagues slipped and fell on a group therapy outing. And by slipped and fell, I mean lost her footing walking down a hill and landed lightly on her tush in the grass. That was a Friday. On Monday my supervisor, who I was expecting to meet with that day, had to cancel with me because she was covering for this individual who was out sick. She continued to be out sick for 3 weeks. When she came back she had a baseball cap and sunglasses on and had a cylindrical pad with a shoulder strap on it that she would lean back against while seated. She asked the clinical director to turn off some of the lights in the conference room during our weekly training meeting and every couple minutes would let out a pained sort of groan. After the meeting, a few of us standing around commented that she was acting a bit like she had opiate withdrawals, but also that it all seemed a bit fishy. She continued to miss a lot of work over the next couple of months, but apparently had an open workers' comp case due to the injury she had gotten on the job, which she claimed was causing severe migraines and insomnia, so she couldn't be fired without an unrelated cause. I think what finally did it was the day several of us were working in the main office prepping for the upcoming school year. She was cutting apart forms as they came out of the printer and sliced about halfway through her thumb with the paper slicer. One of the supervisors took her to the ear for stitches and she immediately asked for Percocet. That's the sort of thing that will get you fired from your addiction counselor job. I have a few from when I was younger, but two really take the prize. My mentor went batshit crazy in front of a client, complete insubordination, at a kickoff meeting for a project she was supposed to be leading with our new boss that had been at the company for a while, but took over as our manager a month before this all went down. I got pulled into our director's office to talk about what went down and was told to move desks and to stay out of the whole thing. She got fired, not only for insubordination in front of a client, but also recording said event without anybody's consent in a two-party state. She fully admitted it too, and used it to threaten a lawsuit against the company and the client for market manipulation. The hard part was she was a good friend and just went down a horrible spiral of drug abuse, verbally and emotionally abusing her husband and eventually cheating on him. I stopped talking to her when she asked me to call their therapist and admit that I, speaking as her husband, was physically abusing her. I texted her husband after that to let him know. The second story, I had helped my boss hire a guy that seemed reliable. About a month in, we notice a number of weird charges on his corporate card with no expense report submitted. My boss approaches the guy about it, and he flips out, saying he can't take the pressure of the job and leaves. He stops answering his phone and just completely cut contact. My boss had to have a fun time of filing a police report for felony theft, dude racked over 10k in charges on his corporate card, and working with ours and the corporate law team to figure out how to get the money back. Not sure what happened to the guy, but I'm sure his credit got faked over from that. I was an employee at a Sears store in Virginia with an abusive assistant store manager. I had the job to make extra money for Christmas. I had a real day job, and I loved my coworkers. They were from all over the world, and taught me how to say bad words in different languages. I had never had a direct encounter with this woman until about 11 p.m. on a Friday night. The store had closed at 10 p.m. We were all scheduled to leave at 10:30. Mind you, I had to get up early the next day for my full-time job. I could hear this woman walking around the store literally screaming at and berating employees about their departments not being tidy enough. She gets to our department, lingerie, starts looking through a bra rack, looks at one of my coworkers, an older Indian woman, and screams at her that the bras are not in order and that they need to be organized before she can leave. Coworker had tears in her eyes. I was livid. My coworker was a hard worker, super sweet, not to mention the department was immaculate. She then walks over to me and screams at me that I need to move it, start helping. I looked her straight in the eyes and said, I have stood here listening to you disrespect employees through the store for almost an hour. I'm not going to let you disrespect me. My shift ended 30 minutes ago, and if you want the bras to be organized, you need to get to it. Then I walked out. I called the next day and had myself removed from the schedule. Complained to Sears about her and her behavior. Found out about a month later that she was fired. She had physically assaulted a young girl. My co-workers begged me to come back, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. When I met a former boss and shook his hand, I got this overwhelming sense of dread. He wound up being the worst boss of my entire career. Within the first month, he started pulling dangerous stunts, such as pulling the entire list of no-quote projects from his predecessor and aggressively quoting them to customers. He pulled resources from my department to assist him personally, leaving me alone to contend with $6 million in projects. He started calling customers after hours to cut deals, and then neglected to inform the team what those promises were until well after the projects were awarded. I continued seeing this behavior and called the executive team in the corporate. I was told I was being alarmist and that the numbers look great from where we are standing. Within the next few months, I noticed my boss was constantly on business trips, but his expense reports, which anyone could look up, did not match where he stated he was. This was because he was using the company card to book vacations for him and his wife, first class. He would simply label it as customer meeting and put his wife down as the customer. I brought that up and was told it's a perk. Bull. It continued to get worse, to the point where I saw lawsuits on the horizon. I again contacted the executive group and again was dismissed. We had no bandwidth, this guy was spinning lies upon lies, and we were headed towards disaster. People were working 70 plus HR weeks, and I was working 80, 120-hour weeks to keep these projects moving, avoiding threats of lawsuits. People started getting injured from fatigue, including 2 severe lacerations, a dismemberment, and 1 case of a bone fracture. Since I volunteered as safety lead, I had to deal with all of them. I was verbally berated for filing these, so people could get their workers' comp. We started getting into heated and near violent yelling matches, since I was the only damn person to call him out on his crap. He would call me at 10 PM and tell me I had to be across the country by 7 AM the next morning. He would call me up to 30 times a day, to the point where I blocked his number and refused to communicate with him unless it was documented in an email. Finally, I was vindicated when the figurative flaw fell out. All of that guy's mistakes came to light all at once. He was fired, but many others, including myself, were scapegoated. I was demoted, while several others were walked out with no explanation. The company lost 8 figures due to that one individual. Everything I had listed out for the execs was 100% true, but instead of recognizing that, they chose to demote me for shaking trees. Slimmer bags. I'm glad I don't work for them anymore. TLDR, worker was caught cranking it on the job. Point: I used to work security in a high-rise about 11 years ago, was a supervisor. The top floor of one of the towers had a penthouse suite that hadn't been leased in a few years, and the maintenance workers had set up a couch with a view of the city, a mini fridge, microwave, etc. Basically turned it into a break room. One day, some of the maintenance guys started complaining that someone had moved the couch, and it had to be us, because we were the only other ones who had access. I asked around. Everyone denied it, so not much I could do for something so simple. A week or so later the maintenance crew complained again. I told the other guys to knock it off, since we have to work with maintenance all the time, and need a good relationship. Apparently it didn't stop. I'll walk through the day it all went down. I was coming into work and the area supervisor was in the parking lot. Very unusual since he lived 3 hours away. He told me to go in, and he'd be in to brief me momentarily. As I walked in I saw him catch the other officer, we'll call him Tim, getting out of his car and talking to him. Point: about 15 minutes later the sup walks in and tells this story. So the maintenance guys decided to put a mini camera in the ceiling air vents. Since it wasn't leased space, nothing illegal. They caught Tim on the couch in the penthouse, having a really good time. Like, a really good time. By himself. And it wasn't the view he was enjoying. Or, maybe he just really liked the cityscape. They couldn't believe it. They called our district supervisor and sent the video. Tim was fired the next day. Bonus craziness, about a month later the district sup was in town and mentioned he'd been contacted by a judge who was hearing an unemployment appeal. Tim had tried to file unemployment and was denied, so he appealed. The sup had only sent in that Tim was fired but no reason, trying not to embarrass the guy too much, so the judge said, unless you can provide a good reason, Tim would get unemployment. So the sup gave all the dirt, including offering to send the video. The judge declined the offer of the video, and Tim's claim was rejected. Saw an incident note at the start of shift in a pub. Lunch service cancelled. Someone took a sheet in the sink. Point: we worked in a pub that had a restaurant attached, but the restaurant shut up at about 10 PM, while the bar stayed open until about 1 AM. Occasionally a drunk customer would wander into the dark kitchen through the saloon doors that separated it. We figured some drunk idiot did that. Then, as a bit of a giggle, they queued up the CCTV. There's a lot of regulars there most nights, so we figured if it was one of them or someone they knew, we'd be able to see why the camera in the kitchen didn't see anything, as it was not a low light camera. but we did see everyone in the kitchen finish shift and leave the kitchen area to have a knockoff beer in the bar, skip forward, and the dickheads back there. There are toilets at the other end of the restaurant, so it wouldn't be unusual for an employee to take advantage of using one that would probably not have any lineup, or to crap in peace, I guess. Instead of heading past the restaurant service area and to the back toilet, he goes into the dark kitchen for a few minutes and comes out. No one else goes in there. They confront him, and after some initial denials he admits he did it because the chef was treating him badly, which was accurate. The chef was a bastard who would rant, yell and scream at staff like a rabid Gordon Ramsay. Needless to say, he was let go. Got one, although not insane. It's funny, 1998. Hiring a guys from India and bringing them over. So many cultural differences, like the time I picked a guy up at the airport at 2 AM and went about 75 miles per hour on the highway to get to his hotel. He was freaked and had never been over 35 or so in a car due to India traffic. I apologized and explained the interstate system as we were past. We will call him Ashish. He stank. Like horrible, gut-wrenching stank of the never showered and has negligible butt wiping skills. I was called from out of town to come and have a talk with him. I flew in the next day and went to the cube environment they were working from. Picture a big square room. My boy Ashish was in the middle. Apparently when he started the week before, the first day was putrid. The next day, we will call him Avish, brought in a fan and pointed it at Ashish's cube. The next day, the rest of the guys brought in their own fans. By the time I got there, it was a little like being in a hurricane, but the hurricane was filled with the smell of a dead goat which had been lying in the sun for a few weeks. I take Ashish aside and explain to him the craziness of Americans and their hyped hygiene. It's true, many countries do not use all the products we do, although many also do. See France's subway system in August. He takes it in and really wants to fit in. I think we are done. The next day I get a call. Apparently Ashish interpreted my conversation as go buy a bottle of Dragon Noir and pour. It was so much worse point I took him for an early lunch, 9:30 AM, and we went directly to the CVS, where I bought him deodorant soap, shampoo, deodorant/antiperspirant, and Charmin. Then back to his place, where I literally hung out on his couch while he took a shower. Told him, hot but not too hot, lather liberally and then fire it up again this time, just to be sure. Then how to use the deer, and threw out the bucket and pail next to his toilet. Don't ask me, have no idea how that's used, and replaced with Charmin. Explained how many squares to start with. Go until they come back clean, but not so many that the toilet will clog. As for Draka, drop, maybe, not required, but if you like it fine. Just remember, a drop, no more. Embarrassing as hell for the poor guy, but I swear he changed entirely. 6 months later he was suave as hell, confident, and doing a fantastic job. Well liked by everyone there. Quit about a year later for a much higher paying role. Thanked me for helping him acclimate to what was literally foreign territory. He went back and got a wife a couple years later, as many do, and was happy working in Chicago. Fast forward a year, and I was called back in to explain feminine hygiene in the US to a new arrival. I passed on that one white male and begged my lead to have his wife have the conversation. That one cost me a $200 gift card for the wife, worth every penny. My wife got called into ours because someone complained that her breast milk she just gave birth and was pumping was in the break room fridge. She always kept it in an opaque lunch bag with a zipper, so there's no way this person would know what it was unless he opened up her bag. The guy complained that he was uncomfortable with it there because knowing it was breast milk made him think of women's apostrophe breasts. Somehow this part wasn't brought up as a bigger issue because it's weird AF point. The crazy part is our lady sided with this guy. Told my wife she should just pump/store it in the bathroom. My wife was like, what the fuck, do you want to eat your food in the bathroom? My baby shouldn't have to either. Luckily, my wife worked closely with the colonel, who was an actual colonel, but was also the boss of the lab she was at. This was also right after Obama passed a bunch of laws requiring companies to do more for nursing mothers. So my wife brought it up with the colonel, all buddy buddy. She reminded them that she was entitled to a lot more than any of the pumping moms were getting, and what they were trying to do was against the law. The colonel wanted to fire the our lady, but she had a friend that was pretty high up, so they settled on reprimanding that lady and sending her to sensitivity training. The nursing moms ended up getting a private office set up as a pumping room, which is becoming more and more common in offices nowadays. Was GM of a pizza delivery place. Every once in a while, the till would be $20 short at the end of the day. My assistant manager, AM, wondered if one of the high school drivers had sticky fingers. It was infrequent, and we couldn't ever figure out what was happening. Then my driver started asking me why I was able to wrap up the end of day closing much faster than the AM. Apparently the AM sat in the office doing whatever and didn't help clean on her days to close. Then one day the area supervisor came in and told me that my AM was no longer employed there. He wouldn't talk about it. I eventually learned that the software tracks all sales info and spits out fancy reports for the area supervisors. If you edit a delivery order after a driver has been clocked out, it highlights red. If you edit a carry out after X hours, it highlights green. My report for the summer had a few highlights. Apparently my AM's report looked like a Christmas tree. The extra time spent in the office at the end of each day was apparently spent finding full price orders, applying coupons and discounts, and pocketing the difference. When the till was short, it was because they couldn't do the math for how much to steal. The kicker is that we both received bonuses % of profit. They would have gotten a portion of that money anyway, but instead got fired. I never did bonus off that stolen profit, even after it was returned with a confession letter. That AM technically owes me like $800 that I would have received as bonus. I worked as a counselor at an inpatient drug rehab center. One of my coworkers didn't have a hand. She never discussed it and hid it so well that a lot of people actually never noticed she was missing a hand. One day a new patient came to me for her first session and was very agitated. She had a history of paranoid schizophrenia in addition to addiction issues, but her meds seemed to be working. The session went fine until she mentioned she didn't want my coworker treating her, as she tried to blow up a federal building and she didn't trust her for other various reasons. Long story short, the patient began to improve and maintained sobriety, but absolutely had an issue with my coworker. My coworker had a history of addiction herself and was very compassionate and explained she had no problem giving the patient space. Multiple times she addressed that nobody was to adjust the patient's meds based solely off her claims, that she tried to blow up a federal building etc. All the other counselors would joke about the patient, since it was especially absurd that our compassionate, recovered and very competent coworker would ever try to blow up a building. A few years later I was doing research regarding the Seattle courthouse and came across a news article. It indicated that a young woman, high on drugs, had approached the building with a bomb and detonated it in an apparent suicide attempt. She survived but lost her hand. Late to the party. Also, I'm not an employer, but this happened at my workplace. Either just before or right around the time I started there. Anyways, there was this guy, we'll call him Roy. He was older than most in our dept, late 40s when most of us were 20s and 30s. I won't go in much detail on how he wasn't the best at the job, but for the most part he did enough to get by, and he was in general a nice guy. Well, he had a rough patch in his life. He was relatively recently divorced, was certainly an alcoholic and pretty sure he was spending every extra cent on partying and booze. We made decent money there. However, he was the guy that liked the early 6 AM shift, and he was always on time. One day he comes in and shares that he'd been evicted from his place and didn't really have a place to stay. He was couch surfing. We had this storage area in the basement of the building where we kept all extra and old hardware. It was a locked area and only the techs had the key to it. We don't go down there often. At some point one of the tech goes down there and notices a bunch of shirts and stuff hanging on a line. Odd thing. Doesn't make much of it. A few weeks later, the stuff is still hanging. He flags it to the manager. They start digging into it. Winds up that Roy had been crashing and sleeping / living in the storage room for several weeks. At the end of his shift, 2 PM, he would mosey onto the bar, drink, come back after everyone was gone, after 8 p.m, make his way to the storage, kick up and sleep in the one crappy chair that was in there. Woke up early, went to the gym before any of the early workers showed up, like 5 a.m, take a shower, wash his clothes, and show up at his desk before his 6 a.m. shift. He did this for weeks, before he got caught. Other than the hanging clothes, there was little evidence of this. When he was asked about it, he answered truthfully and casually, not a single thread of embarrassment, or that he really did anything wrong. Needless to say, they told him he couldn't do that. After that, they cut down the list of people that had access to the key to the storage room. His story ends up much better though. A couple years after that, he met this kind lady that really helped him get sober, figure his life out. He retired many years ago. I'm sure, if she is still in his life, that he is doing great. This happened at my sister's ice cream store. She handpicked and trained a manager, and after a couple of years stopped working at the store herself. Every 6 months they would do a review and some people would get raises. 5 years later, my sister finds out nobody got raises and the manager had given herself a raise equal the combined raises the other employees were supposed to receive. My sister asked questions and the manager figured out my sister knew what was going on. My sister told her she was going to come in the next day to discuss this. The manager called payroll and said they needed payroll early. She gave herself a $50,000 bonus and had all paychecks sent to her personal home. Needless to say, she did not show up for work. Stop payment was put on all the paychecks, so she didn't get the money. She did end up going to jail though. Then my sister called an emergency meeting, informed the employees of what happened, and to give them their raises. Before she could do this, the employees ganged up and demanded she rehire the manager or they would all quit at the same time and she would have no employees. My sister clapped back with, "She'll never work here again. And if you want to leave, leave now, but don't ever expect to work here again. If you change your mind, I won't take you back." Half of the employees left. The other half were then informed of what the manager was doing. They all got raises and a bonus for the money they lost in the past. All but one of the employees that walked out came in and asked for their jobs back. When they found out what happened, they did not get their jobs back, so ice cream is not as wholesome as we think. So this was a complaint made about me. Someone submitted a complaint that the manager at Pizza Hut told them to go fuck themselves and hung up. Here's how that played out. Couple days later, our area manager, AM, and our regional manager, RM, are both there. When I show up for my shift, they ask me to come talk to them and ask if there was anything unusual over the weekend. Told them no, nothing too unusual. I was asked if I might have lost my temper with anyone, and I was like, yeah, I told a guy to fuck off, but please hear me out before you fire me. This dude had been calling multiple times after we stopped taking orders, while I still had about 10 to 15 left to get delivered with one driver. Every time, I had to step away from cleaning and prep work to go onto the phone in case it was one of the orders. Driver had my personal number and used that to let me know his eater, so the orders were all as fresh as possible. Dude was telling me stuff about how we must be pretty bad if I have to keep answering, how I must be some sort of faggot since he can't tell if I'm a man or a woman by my voice, telling me that he hopes I get fired for being so incompetent. I fielded 15 calls after we closed, 9 of which were this guy being bored on a Saturday night and harassing a pizza place. After my driver was back and done for the night, I always answered and went, "Thank you for calling Pizza Hut. I'm sorry to inform you that we are closed. We open again at 10 a.m. Thanks and have a great night," and then hung up. We get one more after the driver was closed. I start in on that and the dude goes, "Man, shut the fuck up." So I told him to go fuck himself and hung up in front of my driver. After hearing this, RM went, "AM, what do you think?" To which he said, "Well, I'm surprised that that's all you said. Thanks for your honesty. Don't do it again, and we should be good to go. Have a good night." I wasn't the boss, but when I was 17 I worked at a small trading post, or in the country. The place was basically several businesses all in one location owned by the same couple. There was a gas station, deli, feed store, and laundromat in one building, a car wash on the side, and an auto shop next door. My family lived up the road, and the husband leased some of our land for his cattle. So I'd known the owners since I was a kid. The wife ran the business end, and she was notorious for only hiring women. She didn't like men, period, and was very vocal about it. But they needed someone strong to work nights, to help the old ladies stock the heavy stuff and to deter some of the local rednecks who'd come in drunk to buy more beer. We get a new employee one day who's an old friend of the owner, and it ends up being just me and her most nights. After a few weeks, the owner starts making new policies that only apply to me. I'm not allowed in the office for any reason. I'm not allowed to take out the trash alone. I'm not allowed to be in the back area of the store alone, etc. And the owner low-key accuses me of drinking beer in the job and tells her friend to keep an eye on me. To my face point, I'm getting pretty fed up at this point, and I'm thinking about quitting when the sheet hits the fan. Turns out someone was sneaking cases of beer out the back and stashing them to be picked up after work. In addition, someone was swiping the keys from the office and stealing the change from the car wash and laundromat. Point, the boss was sure it was me because I'm young and have a business. So she sets up a sting to catch me. Point, and catches her best friend robbing her. Friend admits to framing me. Is fired. Point, boss refuses to apologize to me. Implies that it was somehow still my fault. That's when I knew it was time to go. Late to the game, but here goes. I was a night manager at the America fast food restaurant. They had me switch stores with my GM because we had gotten the store we were at out of the horrible hole it had been in, and they hoped we could do the same at a larger store. The GM, kitchen manager, and I all went to the new store. The GM and kilometers worked day shift. I was on nights. When we got to the new store, most of the managers or shift leads were family of the previous Grams. Lots of this is how we've done it before, and my mama let us. Two things happened almost simultaneously. My fiance was in a very serious car accident and my GM got to the point of no return, full-blown meth addiction. I was the sole caregiver to my fiance, who had broken several ribs and gotten a pretty nasty head injury, not to mention the broken nose, bruises and gashes. He was couch bound and needed assistance with things like getting to the bathroom and showering. The GM completely flaked at any and all duties, couldn't be reached most times, and generally sucked at her job when she was there. Point, I was called in to solve problems because I lived closer to the store and could be reached. On the shifts I closed, I noticed money missing from deposits straight put in the system wrong, etc. I always contacted the GM when this happened, and sometimes money would show up, sometimes it wouldn't. Like, close a shift on Monday, be short 200 exactly. Close again on Wednesday and the deposit was over by 200 the night before. It looked like I was incompetent at counting money. Rumors spread in the nepotism that was manager / shift lead team that I was either stupid or was swiping money and returning it. Now I knew I wasn't taking money, and one time the girl I worked for even called her boyfriend to call his brother, who was a closing manager, to tell him they knew he had taken the money. I witnessed the phone call. The boyfriend came in, also a manager. Everyone was related somehow, helped me count the draws and deposit, and called his brother to return the money. Yet rumors spread I was taking the $sign, and it was probably to pay for medical bills. I ended up having to talk to higher management, and the family all protected the brother and denied it all. I had worked with this guy. He often disappeared, was always messed up, and overall did a crappy job at everything he did. Fast forward another few weeks and I'm exhausted taking on more shifts to cover bills, doing more than my job, and taking care of fiance. I was supposed to come in early for a meeting I was sure was about theft again with my meth addicted GM and higher management. I just said screw it and never went. Never showed up for another shift. The regional manager, who also at this point thinks I'm a thief, leaves me a message telling me he will take legal action if I don't return my keys, etc. I hadn't even been quit a full 24h. So I take my keys in, tell them I'm not their problem and the only person holding the store together, and leave. Here is the best part. 2 nights later, shitty manager that was stealing gets caught on camera doing lines off the desk. They looked at the cameras because surprise he had stolen something like $700 in one night and didn't know I had left and didn't have me as a scapegoat anymore. I hope that place burns. Used to be a marketing manager. Managed about 40 telemarketers. Came out of a meeting one day to hear that our top performer had shown up while I was in the meeting on her day off, totally drunk, and then proceeded to try and remove the pants of a coworker and beg him to let her give him head, all while he was speaking to a top tier client. 15 years later, this language makes me cringe. Her coworkers covered for her, and only the guy who was attacked would say what happened. I suspended her with pay while we investigated and offered him time off with pay if he needed it. He came to work. Time off isn't as much fun in sales because you're losing commission. I called the client just to have a chat and see if the incident came up. The first words out of her mouth were okay. I was so worried about him. She proceeded to tell me a much more harrowing story than even my employee had relayed. Apparently there was a death threat and physical violence involved. We removed her from suspension, called her into a satellite location with no one but me and my boss and security, and fired her with no severance and the clear message that we would support her victim fully if he chose to press charges. He did not. He did call his attacker and tell her that the only reason he wasn't going to take action was that he thought she had a better chance of getting her sheet together without all of that drama, and that she really should think about quitting drinking. I don't know what happened to her after that, but he was really a stand-up guy. Didn't know him too well before the attack, but moving forward I felt I had a good and ethical person to work with. I was temporarily helping a company with PR and fixing their image, while there I was given a high position to be able to work freely. I had lunch with a guy one day and a girl pulled me aside the same night after he left and tells me that he sucks up to anyone high position and will do literally anything to get rid of them to climb the ladder and make himself a raise. The big boss won't fire him without indisputable evidence, which is a good thing. I was told to point not leave food unattended, or he might poison / lax it. Point leave drinks out of view, even when holding them. Check my car for tampering. Didn't drive. Was still told not tell him the hotel I stay at bore him to make him go away. Point. If I absolutely have to use a restroom, go with another person, making sure he don't lock me in except presence in a week. He point locked me in the bathroom. Put mystery powder on my food when it was in the fridge. See below. Kept eyeing my drinks. Asked what I was driving. Asked where I was staying. Point locked me in the bathroom again. Point tried to give me pens and other small trinkets I think may have been bugged. The food was in a fridge during a period he was the one person in the office space on that end, and it was sprinkled and stirred around. Another employee told me he was stalking him. He was caught on CCTV outside a coworker's home after a raise. He kept doing these psycho warning things without the intelligence. Point one day, when he was supposed to be off work, I took everything up with the boss, telling him the company can't fix their image, because when a coworker here quit and tell the world about him, they will all look stupid again. The boss turned out to be a bit intimidated by him and managed to send him to a very remote location in a super cheap one-person office space several states over. He got a raise, but he was separated from everyone else. Point it's not so creepy that I still think about him every day or anything, but when it comes to weird employees, has in the list. I'm not the employer, but rather a fellow employee. I worked as a vet tech for a small clinic and was there for about 4 years. There is an oral pain medication that is highly regulated called Tramadol. Tramadol was a commonly prescribed medication for dogs after routine surgeries, and usually we would only give about 10 tablets at a time. Older dogs would be in it regularly for pain issues. Only certain employees had the authority to order Tramadol from the medical supplier. That way we could track how many bottles we had and how quickly we were ordering them. We also had a log where we would write down how many tablets were being taken from the bottle at a time, who took them out, and which animal they were prescribed to. It was a system that worked fine, and it was easy to audit. There was a woman who worked for us for a little over a year we'll call Jessica. Jessica was a good enough tech, good at taking blood and putting in catheters, never one to put their nose up at doing scut work, and always really good at monitoring for surgery. She really knew her stuff. Her home life was a bit chaotic, but what can you do? Leave it at home and come to your work like a professional. Anyway, after a while, one of our head techs, one of the techs responsible for ordering pain meds, noticed that we had to order more Tramadol a bit sooner than we usually did. This wasn't too big a deal. There are some weeks where an older animal won't be doing great and will need more pain medicine than usual, or maybe we just did a lot of surgeries that month. Putting this info at the back of her mind for a bit, she ordered 2 more bottles. The bottles come with 1000 tablets. Soon enough she notices that, again, we are running out sooner than normal. The tech takes a look at the logs. All the numbers seem to add up. 10 tabs for surgery here, a refill for 20 tablets for an elderly dog there, but she decides to take the tramadol log back into the lunchroom to comb over during her lunch break. She has another tech check her findings. She notices that every few weeks, there are multiple tramadol refills from the same clients, people who should not be running out of pills so quickly. 1 tablet BD for 10 days, that's 20 tablets. It's been 5 days and they're out, but why? This client has been using this medication for their dog for a while. Why are they misdosing right now? And it isn't just one client, there are multiple who are running out quickly. The tech goes into the accounts of these clients, and, sure enough, there are medication labels generated for their pets with the corresponding number of tablets, some generated recently. The bills for these medications have been zeroed out and closed. The tech goes into the medication drawer, but the bottles aren't there. The tech knows the client hasn't come to pick them up yet. Some of these clients don't live close by, or they can't make it on the day they supposedly came to get it. The best part? All of these labels and records are kept under the same name, Jessica. My coworker has another tech check her findings, and sure enough, it's true. Medication is disappearing under Jessica's name. None of the other employees know, including myself, and the 2 women who know stay quiet. They don't want to let Jessica know, so they are biding their time and collecting evidence. It comes at the end of a shift, when the 2 techs call Jessica into the back room. She storms out angry, and never comes back. That night was our company Christmas dinner, and we were filled in on the situation. We were told about the missing pain meds and the logs that weren't matching up. Jessica was logging out tramadol under different clients and pocketing them to sell. She left her purse in the storage room like the rest of us, but my coworkers weren't above checking her bag for evidence. They found a half-full tramadol bottle in her purse. Those bottles are huge, and she just left it halfway sticking out of her bag. She put her sweatshirt on top thinking it would hide it. We never had any issues with pills again after that point. On another note, we had another girl also come in who would randomly nod out during surgery. I'm talking full heroin nod, while watching a patient's vitals. She said it was because she was taking lithium. We would have her go lay down, while someone else would come in to take it over. My boss was pretty naive. This continued for a bit until one of our clients took us aside and said that they found her passed out in her car in the parking lot of the nearby convenience store that a lot of us frequented on our lunch breaks. She was slumped over behind the wheel in a full nod, and when the client knocked on the window to see if she was alright, she slowly came to and said she was just sleeping. We had suspected her to be the one to be stealing the pain meds for a bit, but we couldn't find any evidence. This behavior unfortunately was enough. I was working in hours at a medium-sized company. There were about 20 or so office-type workers and about 80 operations-type people. One of my employees in hours was a young married woman who was very attractive and was known to be very professional and rather conservative in personality, Kate. At this particular time, we had a number of our ops employees who were competing for a mid-level management position. Prior to the selection for the promotion, Kate made an accusation against one of the ops candidates, Mike, stating that she had observed him making a fairly serious safety violation while on the job. Partly due to the investigation of this complaint against Mike, another ops employee, Devin, was selected for the promotion. Next thing you know, Mike comes to management and says that Kate made a false accusation against him, intending to cost him the promotion because Kate was having sex with Devin. Mike went on to say that he and Kate had also had sex a number of times, but that had ended months before. Being her supervisor, I went to Kate and asked her about this. I told her, look, your personal life is none of my concern, but these are some serious accusations that affect our work and I need to know the truth. Kate cried and vehemently denied Mike's accusations. I believed her and went to bat for her to our company VP, saying that Mike must be lying. Our company ended up pulling everyone's email accounts and phone records for those involved that had company phones. It turns out that Kate had, or currently was having sex with 6 different employees at the company, 5 men and 1 woman. Kate was fired very shortly after they pulled the records. I'm an upper level manager where this occurred. An employee was hired to conduct in-home visits for a particular healthcare program. Due to COVID, the employee was temporarily allowed to work remotely from home using video technology to complete their patient assessments on occasion. When the employee was asked to come into the office, they always had an excuse as to why they couldn't make it. Due to COVID, nobody really thought much of the excuses and management let it go. Unfortunately, the employee was not getting their work done from home. They were barely completing any of the required patient assessments and did not seem to really be working at all. Other team members were picking up the slack. There were many attempts from their manager to work with them remotely and help meet job expectations, but they were just not compliant. Finally, they were asked to come into the office for a disciplinary meeting with their frontline manager and ours. They kept making excuses, but they were told that it was not an option, that they needed to come in, or they would be terminated. The employee finally confessed that they had moved out of state right after they were hired and was living over 1,000 miles away from the office and the community where they were hired to conduct in-home visits. They were receiving pay for living in a high cost of living area, but were living several states away in a low cost of living area for almost an entire year. This was a person making a 6-figure salary. Emphasizing was, my wife worked for this toxic company in Orange County a few years ago as a manager. She was brought in to bring company up to current standards, implementing procedures and rules that would make them a reputable company, increasing profit and decreasing unnecessary costs. The company had a lot of employees that had been there 10+ years and were vital to keeping the equipment running. The employees knew this and took advantage of it. Employee 1. He was a shift manager and would date all the girls on the line. Even had his own set room where he'd take employees and girlfriends up to during his shift. Solution: set room gone and moved to a shift mainly full of men. Employee 2. He was the production manager and had financial issues, so he took up a second job. The problem was he was so tired from his second job that he would sleep in his car during his main job, then leave early to attend his other job. Anytime they would look for him, he'd say he was somewhere else in the building. So they started looking at security tapes and found out he was leaving and sleeping. Employee was let go when he refused to leave other job. Employee 3 would constantly have sexual harassment complaints leveled his way, but the owner's wife would discredit the girls as they were minimum wage employees and he would never do such a thing as he had a wife and kids. Fast forward and he puts his arm around my wife's neck and grabs her ass. She immediately leaves work and calls owners. Wife owner informs my wife that if they fire him, my wife will be responsible for all his work. She should just let it go. My wife immediately knew it was time to go. So many more stories, but these were a few of the weirder. My wife is doing great. Moved into a new career field and a nice settlement. Plus all the women that worked there received nice raises as part of the settlement. I had 2 warehouse workers approach me after a long hot day. One looked very nervous. The other was smiling. Something along the lines of, boss, you have to talk to Jard. We can't work next to him anymore. He stinks so bad. You need to tell him to shower, or, I dunno, like maybe fire him? We can't do it anymore. I think you should fire him. Well, Jard wasn't a terribly good employee. He did take constant smoke breaks and was always chugging Dr. Pepper. But he was polite and did his job without issue. A 35-year-old white guy who had a relatively attractive wife and seemed good-natured. Had been with me for a couple years. I hadn't noticed a smell, but granted I don't go into the warehouse area in which he works very often, as I typically watch that area via security cameras from my office. All I knew was he wore a cabbie hat, liked LOTR, and was a bit eccentric. So I say, okay, I'll talk to him in the morning. Next morning I bring him into the conference room. He was across a very large conference room table. The smell was horrifying. I'm a grown man, hardened by time, a strong stomach. I began to somewhat retch within the first word Jard spoke. Instantly I noticed black around his gum line. Dark brown teeth. I asked him, how he was doing, if his home life was going well. His wife had left him. I asked him there had been some complaints about hygiene and odors. I mentioned if he needed some extra money for a dentist or doctor appointment, I'd gladly help him out. His skin was white, chalky, and flaky. His teeth brown from chain smoking, and his Dr. Pepper. That's when he said, and I quote, "Well, I don't brush my teeth because I'm allergic to water." I said, "Well Jard, no one can be allergic to water. Water is essential to survive. You die within 5 days if you don't drink water." "What are you talking about? You don't drink water? Ever?" "No. Only Dr. Pepper for the last year." He had a drive pepper opened, and with him. "But I mean, Jard, there's water in Dr. Pepper. I guess I could drink water, but it can't touch my skin. I'm allergic." "Well Jard, I mean, you do shower right?" "No. Whenever I shower my skin breaks out in hives." "Wait, what? When is the last time you showered?" "January. It was like May/June. We had a little intervention right then and there. I said take the rest of the day off. Go to the grocery store. Buy a toothbrush, some mouthwash, and some soap. And get to work. Or don't come back to work. And go get a dentist visit now." He ended up working for me for another couple years. I forget how many cavities he had when he finally went to the dentist. But it took 4 or 5 trips and like $5,000 to get him through that year. Hope he's doing better these days. There's a joke at my job that everyone over 35 acts like children, but I honestly never thought anyone would prove it this thoroughly. Like pretty much every other office on earth after COVID hit, my company put together a list of rules for being in the building, just the standard 6 feet apart, masks etc. Now, Bob apparently didn't like any of this, because I get a call on my day off from Bob's relief. "Sigh, I can't get to my station. Bob built a fort." Naturally, I have a lot of questions about this sentence, so they explain that Bob refuses to wear a mask at work, so instead he has taken somewhere between 9 to 12 office chairs from around the floor and built a fort around himself. Not just a perimeter, he had them balanced upside down on top of other chairs as a roof. It looked like a chair igloo. So his relief's only way to get to their shared station is to climb into the fort with Bob, and, since it apparently took a while to build his fort, he wouldn't take it down and had gone so far as to print out a sign to make sure the cleaning staff would not disassemble it in order to clean anything. Now, don't get me wrong, I love a good blanket fort on non-work hours, but for anyone who's keeping track, he's keeping multiple people from doing their jobs and giving our department 10 different heart attacks between things not being cleaned between shifts during a pandemic, and the potential liability for Bob's giant chair fort collapsing onto him if it loses structural integrity. Everyone figures at first that it's just one of those getting squally from isolation things, and that he'll take it down once someone points out how insane it is for a grown man in his 50s to build himself a special anti-COVID fort out of chairs. But he doesn't. He is ride or die for his fort instead of wearing a mask. It ended up with multiple hour meetings and Bob the Builder banned from the building. This was a few years back when I was assistant manager at a bakery. I've since became manager and eventually left to pursue something different. We had 6 staff excluding me and the bakery manager. All of them seemed really nice and were all very loyal and reliable. We felt like, at the time, we had a perfect team. My manager at the time was on vacation, so I was running the bakery for a few weeks while he was away. During this time, I had a customer who complained about one of our older employees. He'd been at the bakery for almost 10 years. Never had a problem with him at all before this. She asked to speak with the manager and I explained that it was just me at the moment, but I could help. She told me he asked her inappropriate things and she seemed very angry. I won't tell you the things she said, but at the time they sounded way too far-fetched to be true. I'm not proud of this, but I assumed she was either lying or overreacting. This is only because I've known this man for years and he's always seemed the sweetest guy. We've never had a complaint about him before, so I just told her I'd talk to him. I didn't, and I realize now that was not how I should have handled it. I didn't tell anyone. Looking back now, I should have at least mentioned it to him or brought it up. Later on that week, the newest member of our team, a young girl, about 16 over 17 at the time, came up to me with a note. She was petrified to say anything, so just handed it to me and carried on working without a word. She looked drained, tired. I stood there confused for a second before opening it. I was astonished. She had listed all of the inappropriate actions he had done to her. Touching, flirting, harassment. It was awful, the things that were listed. There is no way this girl knew about the complaints against him either. I called the police, with the young girl employee's permission, and also called my manager, who was just as shocked as I was. So this is a story of my predecessor at my first full-time job. I knew she was fired and wanted to avoid her fate. My managers eventually told me the story after all legal issues were resolved. This girl was the admin/coordinator for a department in a warehouse and was pretty much 100% in the office, would not walk the floor or interact with the rest of the department. Well known for being a huge beach. New manager started, and he noticed that she wasn't at her desk when he would come in, but he was almost always on the floor, so maybe it was a coincidence. Then he spoke to the assistant manager and she noticed the same thing. Time clock showed she was there all day and taking her breaks. Suspicious. So they decided to do a sting operation and have one of them in the office at all times to see where she went. They didn't see her all week, but her time card was still showing her there. Security handed over the footage of the front door, parking lot, and clock and station. They watched as she came in, clocked, then walked right back out. Returned at the end of the day and clocked out. Then they did some digging and discovered the guy was her uncle. He was manually clocking her lunch breaks for her each day by keying in her ID number or using a spare badge. Guy, whose cubicle was within eyeshot of the office, must have given her a heads up that they were in the office more often, because she started coming in, sitting at her desk for a few hours, then leaving when it looked clear. Found out she had been doing this for years. She was then fired and tried to get unemployment. Company wasn't going to fight it, but the managers were all too happy to show she was fired with cause to get her denied. She ultimately didn't receive a cent. Her uncle? He worked for another department, so the managers called his boss, let the boss know what just happened with their employee and to maybe look into the guy. Turned out he was well known around the warehouse for sleeping 6 to 8 hours. Everyone knew except his boss, and pushed his work off on others. So the guy got loaded up with work suddenly and then quit. Last I heard, both of them run a gas station nearby. Had a guy we hired to be a server at the restaurant I managed by my overhead boss, who says despite the guy's lack of experience, his one reference says he's such a hard worker and so eager to work. It's a counter order style with full service after. Super easy job and our system's not too hard. He gets trained by my best trainers on day 1 and by me for part of a shift day 2 before he has his first full shift the next night, and he seems okay. I make sure he's not overwhelmed or having any issues that might affect how we schedule him, etc. Nope, all good. I get a call late one night from my assistant manager. Guy's had some kind of freak out and shut himself in the bathroom with the lights off for an hour and they couldn't find him. Apparently it was too exhausting to be on his feet for 4 hours. We give them short shifts to start for first few weeks, but most of my team work 8 to 12 hour shifts. He's hungry. We fed him that day, twice, and he can't clean the bathrooms. It's too much. That's all he said to my AM. I thought I was being pranked until one of my top employees calls me and goes, yep, that just happened. And I'm not sure if we need an ambulance or the cops because we don't know what's happening. He quit. None of us still understood what happened or why. It wasn't a mental health thing because my assistant manager is a trained psych evaluator for his major, so he knows what to watch out for and how to help, and is going into psychology as a psychiatrist. He just didn't want to work according to his I quit text message. I still wonder. So this was my boss. I worked for a period in a design position at a startup. I was considered the lead and he was the manager. It was just the two of us. It was more for a Zoom fluffing than anything, but whatever. I worked at this place for about 4 months. And one day the owner calls me and says he is going to have to fire me and not pay me the last 2 weeks because I didn't turn in any work. I was super confused because I did all my work and then some and had submitted it all to my manager to review as he requested. My manager requested, so my manager has been trickling in my work claiming it was his. Cause he wasn't doing his work either. So I was doing both our work, and he was turning it in as his. I told the owner I can prove it's all mine. I have all the original files. So I prove it, and he just kinda accepts it. Says I can stay on, and he will pay me. About a week later I get a call from manager. He is going off, that I can't let anything get to the owner without it going through him. Cause owner wants to fire me, and all this. Acting super weird. I get a bunch of strange calls and texts from him over the next week. I talk to owner about it, and he just tells me to play dumb. And keep submitting all my work to him and my manager. Week after that they fire manager. He had a super bad drug problem. They think like codeine and meth. I noticed a lot of things when we would work together. We were remote for most of it. Always thought he was on something. But on top of that, he never did 1 ounce of work and now had 3 sexual harassment lawsuits from 17 to 20-year-olds. The guy died of meth overdose like a year later. I worked at a luxury hotel front desk, and we all got our own individual cash banks of $500 to use during our shifts. After each shift, you would lock your bank up in a safe deposit box on the wall. Every month, they would do a bank audit to make sure that your bank added up to $500. One week we had an international group come in, and their organization had set up for them to all pay for room and tax with traveler's checks. When they checked out, they each had a small balance that we owed them, since they paid in $100 checks upon arrival. In this case, we had to process payouts from our cash banks to each of these guests. The lady I was working with started acting pretty sus and stuttered out something about how she didn't have any small bills to help pay them out. I handled all of them, no problem. Later, I noticed the hotel's general cashier in the back office. I told her about earlier, and that my coworker needed change for her bank. She heads to the change room, where the safe is, and I tell my coworker to go meet her back there to make change. Coworker looks around all awkward, asks if she can do it later. I say it's no problem, we are slow right now, just go. She heads back there. She doesn't come back for an hour, until I see her leaving the building in her street clothes and crying. Turns out she had took the entire $500 from her bank and used it on her weekend trip to Chicago. She was planning on waiting for her next paycheck to replace it. I guess she admitted to having done this multiple times before as well. Yikes. This will probably get buried, but I had a crazy co-worker when I worked the front desk at a private airport. This was the kind of place that stored private small engine aircrafts for rich people and major aircraft carriers for pro teams in NHL and MLB. So lots of high profile people coming in and out all day/night long. Our duties at the front desk were to make sure that arriving guests had everything they needed when arriving or before takeoff, such as booking hotels, cars, vans, ordering catering and anything else they may need. It wasn't the most exciting job, but we got free soup and cupcakes a lot, since they were complimentary in our lobby. Now along comes Jana, fake name. She seems a little off, but she's very bubbly and trying to be everyone's friend. She's getting the hang of things and figuring out who to call for what, all that new hire confusion, but she's working through it for the most part. Then it was like she got comfortable and a little more comfortable and a little more comfortable. She would sit in the back desk where someone standing in front of the front desk really wouldn't notice anyone unless she stood up. We'd start to notice a sweet smell coming from back there. She always wore a lot of perfume, but it was different than that smell. Then we'd notice that smell coming from her breath when she would go to the front desk. We then had some issues where a lot of hotel bookings were wrong or never booked at all, or catering orders that were completely wrong or again, never ordered at all. We'd find placeholder cards in the trash that were used to fill out all of the bookings that were made for arriving or departing customers. These cards were used to let us know how many more flights were expected to come in or out that day, so when they go missing and people show up to take off without us having any knowledge of it, we look pretty bad. At this point, we are a couple months into her employment, and she has become unbearable to work with. You just knew you'd be dealing with an angry customer whose bookings were screwed up because she never did anything for them. We started to find her water bottles that were filled with alcohol. Smelled like cheap rum that you'd get in a fishbowl at a dive bar. She had some serious Meredith Palmer vibes. If Meredith was the worst after weeks of dealing with her being a mess, my attitude toward her became very clear that I was done putting up with her drunk bullshit. And she noticed. One day I'm standing behind the counter talking face to face with a customer about his needs before takeoff. She decides this is the perfect time to confront me about why I have been acting cold towards her. She's slurring her words and getting very close to my face, all while I'm still trying to talk to this customer. The customer can see I'm getting irritated with her and says that I should continue my conversation with her and then I can help him. He was thinking he was about to see a girl fight. Eventually I was able to tell Jana that as soon as I'm done helping this customer I will speak with her. I told her that we all know she is drunk every single day that she comes in. We all know she is the one throwing out place cards and screwing up bookings and orders. She just went in full defense mode and said it was all a lie. She went to management and said I was bullying her. I was already actively looking for a new job and told management my side of the story with all of the evidence to back me up. I ended up quitting soon after, and last I heard, the company paid for her to go to rehab. This one ended up being a low-level embezzlement scheme, but we found out about it through a complaint. Worked as a manager at a Pizza Hut in a very wealthy and generous tip area, so customers wouldn't really care about the price of pizza because they normally ordered high-priced orders anyway. A stuffed crust specialty pizza ran about $17-18 per pizza with deals put on. One of my drivers got his brother hired as a CSR to answer phones and handle in-store customers. Those two worked out a deal where any orders he placed and the driver was going to deliver, he'd tell the customer the full price without any deals. The customer would be paying cash, they just wanted a total, because we were known to put in as many deals as we reasonably could anyway, and then he'd go back into the order and add in as many deals as he could to lower the price, like he could knock off roughly $10-12 off a $50 order. They would split the total extra cash between them. The driver was only losing a few dollars and the brother was way getting more money than his hourly wage. After about 4 months we had a customer come in and tell us what was happening and complain about it. The way the customer found was they had called back after placing an order to add something and the new price was still lower than the price given to the customer originally. Customer has an eidetic memory, so he remembers the conversation perfectly. This happens to the same customer a couple more times over the course of a few months and he finally came in to tell us what was happening. Because of his memory, and he started keeping the receipts, our GM was able to pull up those tickets from the driver audits, order stats and phone records. Our GM and area coach worked together afterwards and started going through all the orders he'd placed, and his brother took that paid cash. Our financial records that were printed out were kept in store. Almost every single delivery order that the brother placed over the phone and that driver ended up taking had a different price between the receipt and what the total was when stated over the phone. I know they both ended up getting fired, but I don't know if charges were pressed. I left about 2 weeks after they were fired. 3 I can think of. One isn't that bad, but just the principle of the thing. My father managed a grocery store and he often hired 15 and 16-year-old people that would work for him until they graduated from a college down the road. Many of them were assistant managers by the time they were in college. Cash started coming up missing. Not a lot, but it was consistent. The company sent in investigators and turned out 3 of the assistant managers were taking $10 or $20 once a week for lunch from the cash drawer and not paying it back. Though the company didn't lose all that much, it just hurt my father that these guys who he had known for so long did it. I've posted this one before and will try and keep it short though it is a long tale. I had a summer job at a furniture store delivering. Guy I worked with was in his 50s and worked there since he was 15. This guy, to hear him talk, was king of the world, had 2 college degrees, tested Genius IG, could do all the framing, roofing, cabinet building, and roofing on a house. He could do electrical too, but was not licensed. He was also a car mechanic. But he couldn't get a better paying job because in this town it isn't what you know, it is who you know. He couldn't get a government job because all the military veterans got them, and he was too smart to join the military. Every store we went into on breaks the clerks were kind of rude to him or ignored. Take his money and no, thank you, come again. One clerk wouldn't even hand him his change, just dump it on the counter. We went into one and the clerk looked at me and said, lucky you, working with Mr. Wonderful. Two coworkers, one was the owner's son, would go to the warehouse that was Mr. Wonderful's to run, and would move furniture around and put it in the wrong place just to fuck with him and make him mad. The guy would throw temper tantrums in the store in front of customers. I asked one of the older coworkers why the owner kept him around, and he said he had worked there a long time and never figured it out. I think it was because the owner, while a sweet man, was a millionaire and had this guy working $6.50 an hour, and I was getting $6.25 an hour, while the temp agency was charging them $10 for me. Just cheap labor. Third case, I worked golf cart cleaning part-time at a course. Coworker was 19-year-old college student. The day I started, the other guys warned me about him. The guy was almost brain dead. Our job was to get the golf carts from the club house and take them to the shed and wash them, park them, plug them in, and do trash. This seemed to be more than he could handle. Carts about half as washed. I had to double check to make sure they were plugged in. When he was done, he would go do trash, 15 minutes at the most, and come back 30 minutes later stoned, and never did the trash. No show, no call. At times older workers had beached to the owner about him, but he kept him around for whatever reason. Some said he was nephew of the owner's best friend. He finally stopped coming in, and I never heard if he quit or got fired. I was one of the first employees hired for the American branch of an overseas brand. The guy they hired to be the US manager was handsome, charming, and seemed to be a perfect fit. He held regional manager positions with top-tier brands in the past, and also had connections in the industry. But as soon as he was given the reins, things started to fall apart. When important tasks weren't done, he would tell me, our guy told so and so to do that days ago, when really there was a valid reason they couldn't do it. He just didn't want to step up and do it himself, so instead he twisted the truth to make us think everyone else but him was the incompetent one. He also would never fill in if one of us was sick, and on a team of only 4 people, that was necessary. One of my coworkers found multiple empty wine bottles in the trash at work after he had been there working late. And when he had to stay at a hotel for a remote event, he went out driving the company rented car for a night on the town, got stopped for speeding, and then arrested for having a suspended license. Somehow he made it back to the hotel in the morning and managed to hide this from us. Finally, one of my coworkers pulled the thread that unraveled all his lies when she was lamenting to a friend about how awful this manager was. Turned out her friend had worked with him in the past, and he had never held the positions he listed on his resume, and half the things he said were lies and exaggerations. When he was fired, he was still allowed to keep the brand new MacBook he was given for work purposes and a month's severance. Had a guy who was a fire extinguisher technician that seemed very competent and polite, always on top of his jobs and focused, as far as anyone could tell. A little quiet and awkward, but a good worker. Started getting little complaints about forgetfulness and him being out of it. Zombie-like was used to describe it a few times. We work in the sun a lot, and we all deal with fatigue and dehydration, so when he used that as an excuse, we took his word for it. A couple weeks pass after the first complaints, and we had all kinda let it go, but then the owner of my company got a call from the employee. Someone had stolen his work van with all his service equipment in it while he was working a job. So once again, we take his word for it and file a police report. He gets a ride home, and we cross our fingers that we can at least salvage something from his van. Next day comes, turns out the van was in the same parking lot that he was working in, parked and locked. His excuse was the same. He was so dehydrated and fatigued that he lost the van. At this point, all of the other techs and managers are just confused and suspicious, but the owner of the company took his word for it and let it go. Then a couple weeks later, the van is stolen again. Employee calls and says it happened while he was working a job at a fast food restaurant. This time the owner decides not to call the police and try to figure out what's going on with his employee. Guy goes Maya. Can't get a hold of the employee at all. The next day the fast food restaurant manager calls and asks us why is your service van parked behind my building? Turns out the employee left his service van open with all of his tools out, with all of the things he was working on still at the back of the van, as if he just walked away in the middle of a job. And as it turns out he did. The employee was strung out on opiates, and he kept getting too high to remember where he was and where he parked, so he just lied and said it was stolen. Twice. So he would go to find some place to get high, and it would wipe his memory like an Etch-a-Sketch, rendering him incapable of finding his vehicle or continuing to work. Would rather put the company through a bunch of BS than just admit he had problem. The owner fired him, then a year later rehired him, much to my chagrin. But, guess what? He did the same exact thing again, just not in a vehicle. After his driving privileges were stripped, my boss put him to work in the shop. He did alright for a while, was sober and even had an interlock system on his personal vehicle, so you could assume he at least wasn't drinking. That would be wrong though. A trainee I had at the shop walked into the break room to see him high and drunk as hell pissing all over himself and my damn carpet. That finally convinced the owner to fire him for good, but we'll see. Sometimes subtle signs mean nothing. Sometimes they mean a person is going to piss on your floor. Coworker was promoted to our department lead. He was a gigantic brown noser and got raises and promotions through zero merit of his work. Well, this lazy sheet would hang out with the managers in their back office all day instead of doing his job on the sales floor. Just FYI, department leads were basically just the sales floor associates who got to train others and were supposed to be next likely in line for moving to supervisor or manager positions. Basically, assistant to the assistant manager. So one day, my department manager comes up one day asking why the hell I'm still using a method to do a certain thing that the company had been very adamant about changing the process and policy on, ready to write me up. I honestly had no idea and pleaded my innocence. After refusing to sign the write-up and ours getting involved, since they saw it as insubordination at that point, others complained and they did some checking and noticed nobody in the department had taken the required trainings that were supposed to be given by our new lazy as kisser department lead. Now, forgetting to do something is one thing, but he lied when first questioned, saying he did do the trainings. Of course he had nothing to show he actually did do his work, which would normally involve training forms being signed off by each employee, and everyone individually said they hadn't taken any such trainings or known anything. Plus there was nothing on the store cameras to support his dubious claims. This kind of fence leaves a permanent record on your employment with Fortune 500 companies' employers. There is a 3-letter acronym I can't remember, but this guy's career was essentially toast if he left the company to try getting work elsewhere. Guess what the store managers did for him? Swept it all under the rug by quickly giving him a lateral transfer, so he wasn't a department lead anymore, and corporate even allowed it. A year later, after they bounced this guy all around multiple departments, he was promoted to a sales manager despite being in the bottom 5% of gross sales with the company. Sheet still makes my blood boil because I was busting my ass hard trying to get promoted and this guy could literally fuck off, lie, throw me under the bus, get caught, and still fail his way up. This happened a year before COVID kicked in, and we were told to WFH early in 2020. Former co-worker pretty much ghosted on the team that she supported for several years. None of her team members really knew she existed. Those that met her in person only recall seeing her around once or twice a month in the office. Manager knew what was up. She got talked to several times about her problem. She'd behave for a week or so after the talk, but went back to being a no-show. She somehow managed to stay employed for like 2 years before it all came to an end. She never showed up in the office. She never attended meetings, in person or online, when we occasionally were allowed to WFH. After a while, she just didn't bother to log in to even appear to be online. Our department does a total reorg at the start of 2019, and now she reports to a new manager and director. They knew what she was up to, so started to schedule meetings with her. She was 30 minutes late to an afternoon meeting with our director. Her ability to get by with being pretty and bubbly wasn't going to save her now. She was supposed to help with a project and the person who had been pretty much doing the work of 2 people was on vacation. The backup from another team got contacted to do the project because the person doing the job of 2 people was out of office and ghost employee was not doing the project that needed to be done. Phone calls started to happen. Meeting between new manager and new director instantly happened and it eventually turned into her finally being fired. They set a trap. She mindlessly walked into it. They finally had enough recent proof as to what she was up to, and ours finally gave them the green light to fire her. No idea if they ever got her work laptop or phone back. I wonder how long it took her to realize that she no longer had access to log into her work laptop/phone. It shut all of her connections off. That was what probably clued her into the fact that she was fired. I would be willing to bet she had another job for a few years and was skimming a decent paycheck from my employer for several years. Her direct manager is no longer employed either. People knew he let her get away with it. I work in a small company as a project leader. Our project is simply replacing some old devices with new ones in rental apartments. Nothing too hard on muscles or brain. Simple service technician tasks first. I was a bit short on employees. Honestly, we were getting desperate. So we hired this guy even we knew he wasn't the brightest. I trained him for the job. He was muscles. I did paperwork and training him to do the job on his own. One day everyone was getting along and everything was fine. Till he was needed for another project. On his first day on this project, he was told to call us after a certain problematic customer or when something was odd. The lady already missed 5 appointments and was blaming us. But this time she waited with her lawyer. He forgot to drive there. The property management never paid the fee for the missed appointments and as far as I know, they don't pay those fees up to today. Great success. The next week he threw some old electronics into the organic dumpster of a customer. Long story short, we were fined big time. Another great success, he forgot to recharge the tablet he was working with and didn't sync it with our server for a week. When it told me I made him upload every single bit of data he wrote down by hand. Well, he didn't for another week and we couldn't send any invoices because nothing was processed. When it complained again, he was called to boss's office, where he blamed me and said it was my paperwork he had to point. Unbelievably, we are still a bit short on staff, and when I wanted to fire him, boss literally said we couldn't afford that. Guess he doesn't want to acquire some new employees. I was a plumber for a local company in Eureka, and we had this guy Jack. He was a known heroin addict among other things, with a 5-year-old son on probation for drug and gun charges with a clear search charge due to his probation, should he get in trouble. He deep down was a good dude, but would rather be a thug than a father. Anyways, among the many times he showed up late and noticeable withdrawals he went through after just a few hours of working, I expressed worry to my employer, especially after being in his house, but didn't share all the details of what I saw as I was 18, dumb, and afraid of the consequences should I mess with in any way. He showed me 10 grand in counterfeit cash, multiple stolen guns, his grow room, and told me he was currently allowing a known fugitive live with him. One particular day I was eating lunch in the van, and when I went back to his place to pick him up, and 5 men armed with pistols were robbing him on his doorstep. I knew if cops came I was in deep shit, so I watched and waited until they were done, and he came back to the van to resume our workday. A week later Jack broke his hand on a Saturday and would not seek medical attention as our boss recommended. Finally, on a ride along with my boss, I told him please don't make me work with him anymore, I genuinely fear for my safety. He was confused, but knew Jack got in trouble frequently, so asked me about what I knew. I told him everything, and he was fired over the phone minutes later. 2 days later his roommate pissed at Jack shot at his feet. AMD swarms of police showed up at Jack's place. With no need for a warrant due to Jack's probation, he was arrested for everything in front of his child. I quit that company 2 months later as well. Also, he did break his hand, but he, rather than having it slammed in a bathroom stall, he broke it beating the fuck out of a dude's face and making him walk from one side of Eureka to the other completely naked over stealing a marijuana clone. My company has corporate housing for engineers as a benefit. Employees don't have to pay to live there, and the housing is usually upscale apartments or condos. We expect our engineers to respect basic upkeep of the residence and whatnot. I heard a complaint from not 1, but 2 employees who were sharing a corporate apartment with Joe. Well, call him Joe. The complaints were that Joe would leave dishes out on the counter, didn't cover any of his food in the microwave, so it would get extremely messy, and he wouldn't clean it, would leave his dog equipment, leashes, pup bags, collars, etc. on the dining room table, would listen to loud TV late into the night, and similar things. He refused to clean up common areas, because I'm not the only one who uses this stuff, so why should I clean it up myself? Joe also had issues with hours, because he didn't think he got paid enough, would complain when we asked him to come into work. He sometimes worked remotely due to anxiety, and was apparently just a general asshole. So, I get another engineer who comes to me one day with all of these complaints about Joe. I go over to the corporate housing, and observe what the complainant had said. Absolutely disgusting, by the way. A layer of dog hair in the carpet an inch thick in some places. Joe was reprimanded by Hours, and ended up quitting not too long after. I often argue with Hours, if someone says they want to quit, if it is over money, and see if I can get their pay bumped, but Joe, I was glad the day he put in his 2 weeks. I feel sorry for his future employers. I did get a request for a reference call about 6 months later. Needless to say, I didn't call them back to help Joe out. Longtime chef first job. One of the sous chefs burst in 50 pounds of mashed potatoes. Had the head chef taste test them with a sheet-eating grin on his face. Happily walked out. Had a sous chef that would come in early morning to prep, but saw on the cameras he would sleep for maybe 3 to 4 hours in the beginning of every shift. The camera angle was bad, but he walked right in front of it to jump up on the prep table, where his shoes wouldn't move for hours. Heard that a 36-year-old coke addict chef held a 16-year-old kid against the wall, quite violently, for talking to the chef's girlfriend. I had watched the kid talking to her. There was nothing uncouth about it. That same chef asked me to come fill in for an hour or two. He had a couch to move. Bartender comes back and asks me if I sold dude cocaine. I said no, I'm here while he moves a couch. Check the cameras. He went straight to the register and took out $200 and left work. I ended up quitting that job because apparently that guy's behavior was a-okay by them. They even let him stay in the apartment upstairs, basically for free. Fry cook ended up putting his arm up to his elbow in fryer oil. Afterwards we found out that he was attempting to stir the food around in the fryer. Turned out he was super faked up on opiates. Dude's arm was trashed. The skin looked like it was just melting off his arm. He pulled it out of the fryer, looked at it calmly for a few seconds, then started screaming bloody murder. At a retail place I worked, there was an assistant manager who would routinely smoke crack on his lunch breaks. Did a lot of weird shit. None of this mattered. What mattered was when he broke into an employee's car and stole her underwear out of her laundry basket. Denied it up and down. Dude had access to the cameras, should have known where they were places. And lastly, worked with this kid for a year. Very quiet kid, awesome to work with, just really hard to get him to ever say much of anything. Imagined he was like that all the time, like he went home and played video games and that was it or something. One day, the state police show up at work. They are looking for quiet kid. Quiet kid had been there, maybe a minute prior. Turns out, he noticed the cops and dipped out the back. Apparently he had been scamming quite a lot of people out of a lot of money. He never came back and was arrested a month later. Had this weird guy come into the shop. Everyone thought he was just socially awkward, but the female will just call her K, would sometimes go off on him or say he was doing weird things. She complained that one time she was babysitting and fell asleep and woke up to the kid talking to someone on her phone. When Kay snatched her phone from the kid, she saw that it was the creepy new guy and hung up. She showed me the texts afterwards where he was like, "Was that your daughter?" Put Emily back on the phone with her daughter. There was also a time she was working at her desk and he was leaning over the back of the chair and said something that caused her to slap him and walk out. One of my co-workers and I eventually had a sit down with both of them, and basically we all agreed that since whatever they had going for interfering with work, they should keep contact to a minimum even outside of work. Literally that same day, he started texting her. I eventually got promoted to manager and fired him as my first duty, which is a whole other story, and during my firing of him, he defended himself saying she would frequently come into the store and offer herself to him. 2 days afterwards, He came in an hour before closing because he knew that Kay would be by herself and dropped off 3 phones to be fixed. Cell phone repair shop. Coworker came in early morning and told him to come pick his sheet up and never come back. I worked on a golf course one summer, 2003, and minus waking up at 4 am, the job was very easy. Also free golf when the shift was over. There was this guy I worked with named John who had a bit of a screw loose, but was a nice guy otherwise. When golfers came through, we pulled our equipment to the side and let them play through. If they waved or said hi, a wave back while taking a smoke or a rest was all the acknowledgement we were supposed to give. Apparently John was chatty and liked to talk to the golfers, which by and large was harmless, but caused some complaints. I was asked to work with John one day and sort of keep tabs on him. We had a deal with the course restaurant which would make these awesome sandwiches for us, drinks and chips for $5, so that was a daily go-to. I sent John to go pick up our lunches and some time starts to pass. 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour. Where the fuck is John? I have a cell and I start calling the other workers. Hey, you seen John? Nothing. Call the restaurant at the course and John isn't there. It's about a mile walk to the restaurant, so I make my way on foot. John took the cart, and about halfway there, I find the utility golf cart in the driveway of some very expensive home with a dirty shovel and rake sticking out the back, and there's John standing in the threshold of someone's home, dirty, disgusting and sweaty, talking on the person's phone. Apparently John had to use the phone, so thought it was a good idea instead of asking to use mine. He knocks on the door of a home he owner and asks to use this. It's 2003, so cell phones aren't completely ubiquitous yet. My boss rolled through on his rounds between checking up on us and faking the food and beverage manager. That was it for John. I worked night shift as a supervisor. There were 2 of us to cover the week. The other supervisor was a bit odd and creepy. Literally did a mail order bride situation with his wife. Not sure where she was from. She was nice, though he was really nonchalant about his job and would disappear a lot, for hours at a time. They got suspicious and a couple of the employees decided to go look for him. Hours went by and they never tracked him down. Suddenly he'd show up, everybody wondering where he's been. After a week of looking they found him sleeping in a room that was next to his post. He had pillows and blankets that were not there every morning after he left. It was kind of impressive that he could slip away, not get caught, sleep, and clean up his laundry, and get out before anyone noticed. How do you get past people holding blankets and pillows without being noticed? The really shitty part though is what one manager did to get rid of him. She, in concert with another employee, he was a retired cop, decided that they would set up a video recorder to monitor his activities during his shift. Other employees warned us it was around, but management never said a word. They left it up for weeks without approval from the required parties, which made this a felony. After they had enough details, they pulled him into the office and fired him. Rumor has it, they admitted to the recording and he wasn't even wise enough to know that he had them on a felony and could easily had pressed charges on his way out the door, which honestly I wish he would have done. That manager and former cop were not good people. Let me start by saying I have zero problems with people who are gay from any gender. I worked at a hobby shop with this guy 20 plus years ago who would say, you know what would be funny? Now when he would say this, you just knew it was going to be something strange. Like, let's launch a model rocket off in the plaza where we worked. Now these were not your average model rockets from a kit that he wanted to launch. He wanted to attach the biggest rocket engines that we sold to a sharpened broomstick and launch it into the sky and have it drop like a spear someplace in the plaza to see what or who it would hit. Now for the bizarre area that he eventually went to with me and a few of the other people who worked there. Over time he started to say it would be fun to drug a male coworker of ours, strip his clothes off, and take all of the model train tracks that we had in the store and drive a model train into this coworker's as who would be face down as up on the floor with some device holding his as open. And this went on for a while about this guy, and eventually the train scale went from the smallest size to the largest possible model train that we sold. He also had to tell me that if you went to big chain bookstore, that in the men's bathroom guys would write their phone numbers on the wall looking for a hookup. Why did I need to know this? This was early dial-up internet days. And if you asked him If he was gay he would lose his mind on you about how gross that is, and he wasn't an expletive this or that about gay men. And when you asked why it was that he wanted to do stuff like this to our coworker, if he wasn't in fact gay his response was it would be funny. Oh no it wouldn't be funny. He eventually left the store. Fun times working in retail. So not the employer, but I started in the company as a trainee in September 2017. The other trainee started half a year earlier. He was fine during the first months. I mean it's a wholesale job, how much can you fuck up? Then he started to be some extra kind of stupid when he was in customer contact. Our boss thought no worries, let him do our warehouse for a week or two. Then he'll get his head straight. Spoiler, even that went south. He forgot to do important stuff on a regular basis, had a sloppy work moral and an even sloppier working method. So our boss said to him what had to be said. He gets his sheet kinda straight for the next few months. So we are in late 2018 now. One day he cut himself with a box cutter. We were two firefighters with a bit first aid training, so no worries, he was fine. But he insisted on calling an ambulance. So we did. He went on and refused any treatment from them or going with them. Instead he called his mom to pick him up and drive to a hospital. He called in sick for the next 1 to 2 weeks after that point. But now comes the good part of the story. He kept calling in sick throughout the year, so he was at about 285 sick days at the end of the year. But we couldn't fire him for that, because he got his letter from a different doc every time. And then he sued us for mobbing and failure to provide assistance when he cut himself. Long story short, he of course got nothing out of that. And remember, I was only trainee back then. TLDR, idiot doesn't get his sheet straight and cuts himself at work and sues the company for his idiotic behavior. I had a guy that ended up as my boss because of a reorg. We worked at a college branch campus that went from 2 departments in it down to 1. In his previous department he was stripped of all of his managerial responsibilities because he was such a terrible manager. Well, after he was in charge he was just an all-around terrible manager, power tripping and favoritism left and right. Well, for a short list of the actual fireable offenses, he had multiple females report him for sexual harassment, yet his bosses and ours did nothing. It got to the point that campus police was keeping an eye on him and looking for a reason to arrest him so that they could ban him from campus. That happened after some of the women got pissed about the lack of action through official channels and reported him to the campus police. He once told me that I was not allowed to bring our shop vac over to an office I just got done installing conference room equipment in. He told me that I needed to call the head of custodial to have them clean up. So I told him we have always done a rough cleanup with a shop vac and rag, so the custodians don't ruin their vacuum sucking up bits of wire, drywall, and sawdust. He said I don't care. So I did what he told me and called the head custodian, who called her director, who called my boss and shoot him out, and then called me and said go ahead and clean up. He was a big gamer, so he started bringing in his box with another employee and everyone would sew a pizza party and play video games every other Friday during summer. I was okay with that, as we didn't have classes on our campus on Friday and it was summer, so the workload was super low. When fall rolled around I told him we needed to drop the Friday thing as we had stuff to do and someone was going to catch on eventually. Well, eventually happened a few weeks later when the dean of education wandered in and saw what was happening. His boss gave him a slap on the wrist and told him to cut the gaming at work. So he bought a second box and mounted it under his desk and hooked it up to his second monitor. Then he had his boys set up a spare TV and box in our workroom. So I started going in the workroom every morning and taking pictures showing that the controllers were in a different spot on the table every day. At this point I typed up a list of 10 bullet points and scheduled a meeting with his boss to discuss him. I went over everything and told her you can ask the other employees to back up all of this. I knew she already knew all of it, as I and other employees had been reporting these things for the last year, but I was sick of it and ready to make everything official. So she took me up to the CEO's office and I told him everything as well. I was thanked for reporting it and sent on my way. The next day the guy in charge on another campus showed up first thing in the morning and said for the next 2 weeks he and my boss we are switching campuses. So the new guy talked to everyone and was basically told everything we had already reported. Then 2 weeks later our boss was back and nothing changed. A couple months down the road I got a call from a coworker while I was working on someone's computer. She said get back to the office now. When I got back Arshio and my boss's boss were there. They said that my boss just got fired, he is banned from campus, and we now report to his boss. So I asked, we all know what has been going on around here. He has committed so many fireable offenses, and was still here. So I would like to know what he actually got fired for, so that I can make sure none of us are doing anything wrong. I was told we didn't need to know the reason, but we were all in the clear, never did find out what was actually the straw that broke the camel's back. So nothing insane like some of the other stories, but a terrible boss that just kept faking up and didn't care. So this is a sales associate and my manager. I worked at a phone store in southwestern PA. I had a regional manager that was just crazy and cheaty person. To my understanding, she would do things that would be on par of how are you fired yet, or how are you regional manager for the Northeast chain point. Before getting into the list of crimes, I'll give a little background. She started as a sales rep about 7 years back at the same store and she pretty quickly worked up to be a regional manager. This is a version affiliate of a pretty big phone retailer. However, because our store was so close to her, she came to our store instead of the local office point. Now, here's a few things she has done. Starting with the inappropriate first point, she talked about her sex life pretty vividly to all sales associates, whether we wanted or not. Showed me literal porn while working because the girl does something funny. When all the managers leveled district and up to the Las Vegas headquarters, she had an affair with a district manager. This district manager had a family, wife and kids as well. She boasted that she cheated on him and told everyone that she was proud to be his side piece. She also told me stories of how they hooked up during a meeting. By the way, she had a fiance that I'm not sure if she knew. Now her inappropriate work ethics. Since this was a sales position. When working, she told us to add items unbeknownst to the customer like cases, charges, etc. onto the customer's bill and say that it's a part of a package. She used to take the trade-in phones and sell them under the table to other people. Found that one out because a random customer told me she told customers that those tablets that phone companies try to sell you on a contract was completely free, no strings attached. Even if a customer said no, she would still add it onto their account. This got tons of people stuck with these tablets. I found out that my mom, luckily she likes the tablet, had the same thing done to her. After I found out what she was doing. I was only there for about 6 months as school started and couldn't stay full time. But when I spoke to an old coworker, he said that because of the numerous complaints of stuff I still don't know about, she was fired. There's tons more, but there's a reason all the stores called her Female Hitler as a nickname. Not my current role, but a cable call center I used to manage. Had a customer complain one of our employees was calling them and threatening to meet them and fake an accident so they could sue them for assault. All this because the customer wanted to add a channel and this 10-year veteran suddenly didn't know how to do her job. When we reviewed the call, the customer was flustered and called her out on this, but we couldn't find any calls on our system from her or any other agent to the customer. Thought the customer was making it all up, but we kept getting complaints. Customer started recording the calls and sent them to us when they got a threat that the offender would sneak in their house at night so they could do some things that would basically end with the customer arrested for at point. When we heard the recording, it was clearly the agent. Customer had phoned with another company, but we were able to work with them to find out what number the agent was calling from. Basically, she was doing this to hundreds of customers. Basically anyone who asked her to do her job. Ours wouldn't let us fire her because she had previously sued the company due to medical and severe, legit, anxiety issues. She was basically allowed to work an hour a week and get paid 40, never had to be held accountable for any of the metrics her peers were, and was still able to get away with this. Craziest rep I ever met. Still didn't expect that. I'm not exactly an employer or even employee, but I think this applies. I'm a teenager. In my town, all students are required to dedicate at least 12 hours a week to community work. It's part of the curriculum. I got one of the smaller animal shelters when I was 14. It isn't very big, housing only about 30 animals at any given time. As far as I know, 6 full-time employees who specifically cares for the animals and its needs, while all the chores are done by the students. I share the same shift with 18 other students. So, about 3 years ago, halfway through the school year, this girl named Alyssa, or however you spell it, got drafted into our division. I didn't know her much, as she was from another school, and she was more assigned to the cats areas, while I did the lawn and general cleanup, but I personally had no problem with her. She talked about divorce a lot, but she was bright and optimistic, and didn't seem to mind volunteer work the few times we talked. A few weeks after she joined, she burned herself while on kitchen duty, scalded herself, sent to the hospital, blah blah blah. Again, really optimistic. Came back to work as usual for her next shift was what I heard, but with a cooling pack on her arm. She healed, but then she got injured again a few weeks later. This time I was there. I was cleaning the yard of dog shit while she tried to get a cat out of a tree. Fell down the tree, but it's only a tree, so it wasn't such a big deal. But then this continued for a few months. She was constantly getting injured, whether at the shelter or at school, and we all chalked it down to her being clumsy. But halfway during the school holidays, when we had to volunteer 24 hours a week, she got slammed by a car while walking a few dogs with a few other volunteers. Only her, neither of the other 3 were even injured. She wasn't hurt bad either, as the dogs she were walking took the brunt of the damage. 2 died on the spot, 1 was put down due to injuries. Obviously, as this kinda counted as a school activity, chaos ensued. Her parents were called, teachers were called, the police showed up, blah blah blah. This was a car accident, which meant it involved the police. According to rumors, the police found out from some CCTV she purposely ran out and got hit by that car, and she had a mental disorder that made her want attention bad enough that she'd hurt herself for it. Crazy shit. Not employer, employee, but I just left a secular homeless shelter that claims to be progressive and anti-racist while treating Latino residents like dogs and completely leaving Asian residents to fend for themselves. I fielded all complaints alone, and I alone took them seriously. Mind, this shelter exists for severely physically ill people. This is in no way safe, aside from it being morally wrong. They mandate training on racism against black people, yet it's totally okay that Asian and Latino clients don't even get the dignity of names there. Just being called the Chano-Feast/Mexican, apparent gender here, has nothing to do with resident turnover race, nor is it please give this to the Latino man in the orange jacket by the window, but give this to the Mexican. And there's 5 Latinos in the group, and they mean someone from Honduras. Same for Asians, just swap for a Chinese. There is transphobic harassment against workers and clients, while they pretend to be so into pride, and I myself have been told it's rude and unprofessional to not assimilate to American culture, because we love diversity. I took the accounts as well as things I saw with my own eyes on my own, and brought this all up the chain, and got retaliated against by no longer being scheduled and screamed at for being ungrateful for their dirt treatment of me and marginalized clients. Something I've learned in life: the guy screaming at you to be grateful is the exact person you have nothing to be grateful of. They fired me without officially firing me. I just suddenly no longer have hours, and I'm not allowed to contact other sites, even though I'm supposed to contact other sites if there's no hours at main, thinking I couldn't retribute for wrongful treatment and retributive termination. But I've just reported them to the city, since they are a city contractor. And I can pursue reconciliation, even though I'm just totally done with 2 years of this toxic dump, and I'm gonna look for a temporary job selling suits or something, while I finish case management training for an Asian organization that actually wants me enough to point me to the training. I know a few people there, it's in my neighborhood, and I've gone down there for professional advice a lot, so they are well aware of what all's going on. Just in case anyone's looking at this, I'm not gonna mention similar past employers and what they've done to me, but I've been told I should write a book about this stuff, and know that the job I'm leaving now is the best one I've had in the field. I've fought places where Latinos were thrown in a back room and forgotten while Asians were made the house servants of the white and black residents, including elderly, disabled, and pregnant Asians, and I've fought security measures being turned into a way to keep Muslims out. I want to further add that basically the bottom 50% of the company was faking the analog timesheets. They switched to digital, but no one got in trouble. I had a shift partner for 4 months that would just walk off on the clock for 3 hours and go shopping. I tried to approach him like a gosh darn adult, and he said it was his right to do so, because working that site was a favor to middle management. I got screamed at for trying to deal with the situation, and then for reporting it. They never dealt with it. He still works there. People refuse to change client beds, fake facility rounds. Residents can end up sleeping in their own excrement, and I once discovered a resident who'd been paralyzed and bleeding all over all night, and the overpass had no idea because they faked the round logs. People are known to clock in, go to post, sleep all night or punch in, and walk off for hours. They don't get in trouble. I do for trying to change this. Admin loves running a dysfunctional dump.